पंच सैद्धांतिकी का मैंने एक मॉडल पेश किया था। तो उसके बारे में मैं 2 शब्द कह के फिर आप सबसे आपकी राय लेना चाहता हूँ। हमारे 3 अध्येतागण हैं। तीन हमारे अध्येतागण में से 3 हैं सदस्य जो अपनी बातें कहेंगे आज। तो जैसे मैंने कहा कि पहले भी हम ये जान चुके हैं कि भारत विद्या जो है वो किसी की मोनोपोली नहीं है, किसी का उस पे अधिकार वैसे नहीं है, हमारा भी नहीं है और दूसरों का भी नहीं है। और स्व और परा के बीच में जो आदान प्रदान है उसी से ये विद्या विकसित होती है। ऐसा नहीं है कि और पिछली बार मुझे एक बहुत अच्छी चीज याद आई जो पीटर शार्प जी ने कही थी। उन्होंने कहा था कि मैं जब पाणिनि पढ़ने लगा और फिर मैंने वेद भी पढ़ा, भगवत गीता पढ़ी। उनके परिवार वाले इसमें बहुत गहराई से गए क्योंकि उनके भाई साहब जो थे वो महर्षि महेश योगी के अनुयायी बने थे। तो वो अपनी कुछ उनकी कहानी थी, लेकिन उनका दावा ये था कि मुझे यानी उनकी बात कर रहे थे, अपनी बात वो कर रहे थे। वो कह रहे थे मुझे लोग कहते थे तुम क्यों आके यहाँ पढ़ रहे हो ये चीज, है ना, तुम तो बाहर के आदमी हो, यहाँ आके क्यों पढ़ रहे हो। फिर उन्होंने इनको समझाया, उनके आलोचकों को उन्होंने इस तरह उनको समझाया कि देखो विद्या की है जो वो विद्या ग्रहण भी करे और उसका प्रयोग करे। मुझे लगता है ये बहुत बड़ी बात है। विद्या आपकी नहीं है क्योंकि आपके देश में वो प्राप्त हुई है। विद्या आपकी नहीं है क्योंकि आपकी भाषा में वो लिखी गई है या आपके प्रांत से आई है। विद्या आपकी होती है जब आप उसको आत्मसात करें, जब आप उसको ग्रहण करें। तो ये है। तो हमें वेदों की जब बात करते हैं वहां भी वही चलता है, ब्रह्मविद ब्रह्मैव भवति। आप ब्रह्म को नहीं जानते हैं तो आप कौन सी बातें कर रहे हैं। तो ये हमारे यहाँ साधना का जो एक किस्म से पक्ष है, हमारे संस्कृति में, हमारी सभ्यता में इसको बहुत महत्व दिया गया है। अब जो आखिरी चीज मैं कहना चाह रहा हूँ वो ये है कि हमने देखा है कि जो नकारात्मक भारत विद्या होती है वो 2 किस्म की होती है। एक तो वहां से बहुत ही विकृत और विक्षिप्त रूप में हमारी संस्कृति, हमारे ग्रंथों या हमारे सिद्धांतों को उसका एक दुराग्रह से उसको पेश किया जाता है और उसकी प्रतिक्रिया काफी खराब होती है क्योंकि हम भी उसको समझने लगते हैं कि मतलब हमारा जो आप कह सकते हैं भरोसा, यकीन है, वो कम हो जाता है, आत्मविश्वास टूटता है। और हर एक जो संस्कृति जिसको गुलाम बनाया गया है, गुलामी के दौर से वो गुजरी है, उसका हाल यही है। एक किस्म से वो हम कहते हैं हीन भावना उसके अंदर पैदा भी होती है और उसी को बढ़ाया जाता है। और फिर जो अपने में जो त्रुटियां हैं उसी पे ध्यान दिया जाता है, एक नकारात्मक रवैया पैदा होता है। ये सब चीजें सिर्फ काल्पनिक नहीं है, हम सब इसको अनुभव कर चुके हैं। ये वास्तव में सच्चाई में ये सब है। तो इसका तो हमें नकारना, इसका तो हमें जवाब देना ही पड़ेगा, ठोस जवाब, जैसे श्री अरविंद ने कहा है, ना कि एक नकारात्मक रिएक्टिव जवाब। तो ये एक उभर के आया। लेकिन जो चीज जिस पे मैं ध्यान हमारा सबका लाना चाहता हूँ वो ये है कि हमने कल भट्ट साहब ने भी कहा था कि विवाद के जो प्रोटोकॉल्स हैं, उसके शिष्टाचार जो है वो निर्धारित हो चुके हैं हमारी परंपरा में। तो वाद एक होता है, वितंडा कुछ और ही है, और विवाद भी कुछ और होता है। और संवाद वो होता है जहां दोनों मिलके एक सत्य की तरफ जाने की कोशिश करते हैं, और उसी में पूर्व पक्ष का बहुत बड़ा महत्व है। मगर ये जब हम अंग्रेजी में लिंग्विस्टिक्स में इसको कहते हैं फेलिसिटी कंडीशंस। जब कंडीशन हो तो इतनी मुश्किल नहीं लगता मुझे। आज हमने प्लूरलिज्म, अनेकांतवाद की बात की, मगर जब लड़ाई होती है, नैरेटिव वॉर, मैं इस पे थोड़ी सी नजर डालना चाहता हूँ। जब हम एक युद्ध की दशा में हैं, जो युद्ध हमारे बनाया नहीं है, वो हम पे थोपा गया है। तो ये नैरेटिव वॉर की जब दशा होती है, तब हम क्या करें? तो हम अपनी बात किस तरह दुनिया के सामने रख पाए, ये छोटी बात से लेके बड़ी बात तक है। आप देखेंगे आज के मीडिया में, विदेशी मीडिया में, आप अपनी बात रखना चाहें तो आपको जगह नहीं मिलेगी, लेकिन आप कुछ नकारात्मक चीज लिखेंगे तो शायद आपको जगह मिलेगी। और ओरिएंटलिज्म की, आप ब्राउन ओरिएंटलिस्ट है, रीओरिएंटलाइजिंग होता है, यानी जो हमारे विपरीत है उनके जो नुमाइंदे हैं वो हमारे बीच में है। जो व्हाइट मैन्स बर्डन की बात होती थी वो नहीं है आजकल। व्हाइट मैन्स बर्डन कहाँ है? अब हम ही उनके सिपाही बन गए हैं, हम ही उनका काम कर रहे हैं। को अपने आप ये काम करने की आवश्यकता नहीं है। तो नैरेटिव वॉर, और फिर डीप स्टेट, और फिर जैसे फाउंडेशंस हैं, एनजीओज हैं, ये भी इसमें शामिल है। इसमें बहुत बड़ा एक चक्रव्यूह बना है। एक इसमें प्रोत्साहित करने के अनेक तरीके हैं। तो आप उनके गिरफ्त में आ जाएंगे तो उसी के अनुसार आपको चलना पड़ेगा। ये सब वस्तु स्थिति है। यहाँ पे नौकरियों का भी सवाल है। जैसे कल सराव जी कह रहे थे हमें नौकरियां हैं, नौकरियां नहीं मिलती हैं। और अब उल्टा भी हो रहा है कि अगर आपको कोई योग्यता हो न हो, निपुणता है या नहीं, लेकिन आप किसी विचारधारा, जो बिना समझे भी आप वो, अगर आप उसका झंडा लेके खड़े हो जाएंगे तो अपेक्षा है कि इस वजह से हमें कहीं पद मिलेगा। तो ये सब हम इससे गुजर रहे हैं। और 20 साल, 25 साल, 50 साल के बाद इससे कोई फायदा नहीं होगा। अगर हमारे जो सभ्यता, संस्कृति का पुनरुत्थान करना है, यहाँ पे हमें नॉलेज सोसाइटी बनानी है, विश्व गुरु की भी बात हो रही है, तो इस तरीके से तो नहीं होगा। तो इसलिए रीथिंकिंग इंडोलॉजी, भारत विद्या पर एक पुनर्विचार और पुनर्अवलोकन जो हम करना चाहते हैं, इसके कुछ बिंदु मैंने आपके सामने रखे हैं। और अब मैं आपसे दरख्वास्त करता हूँ, प्रार्थना करता हूँ कि आप भी अपने विचार सामने रखें। हमारे तीन वक्ता जो अध्येतागण हैं हमारे, उनमें से हैं, और बहुत ही वरिष्ठ और विद्वान हमारे अध्येताओं से हैं। तो मैं पहले राजवीर जी से अनुरोध करूंगा कि वो अपनी बात रखें। राजवीर जी।
Thank you very much, sir, for giving me this opportunity to place some of my scattered, thoughts and share them with you. Firstly, let me begin by complimenting you for organizing a very wonderful two-day international seminar on a very relevant theme also. As you have rightly said, even in your introductory speech and also today, as to where do we go from here? That is basically the question before all Indologists and those who are interested in understanding and exploring India and Indian knowledge tradition. In fact, I would begin from where you ended, and that is whether merely living with the past will help us, or whether we should try to predict future India, reshape the modern India by having a dialogue with the past and engaging with the present. And then, of course, presenting a plan for shaping the India of today and also India of the future. At the same time, I would say that while we should not really be ashamed of taking pride in what is ours and what we have given to the world, particularly we have given to the world an idea that the entire world is a family, and there cannot be anything more relevant than this idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, to have peace globally and to work for the welfare of the entire humankind living in any part of the world. But at the same time, I would also say that while I would rather begin by saying that we must awake, we must arise and rest not until we tell the truth to the world about our nation's greatness. True, we must tell the world as to what greatness belongs to India, but I would also request that first we must have deep knowledge about ourselves. Until unless we have that deep knowledge about ourselves, perhaps we may not serve the cause of knowledge. And in fact, the knowledge should be transmitted to knowledge. So this is one. Second thing which I would like to say is that, in fact, today, what is happening? And that is the second aspect to which I would like to draw your attention to. And that is that India perhaps is the first country which considered Vidya as the greatest source of wealth. विद्या से बड़ा कोई धन नहीं है. ये भारत की एक सोच है, भारत की अपनी एक आइडियोलॉजी है. और हमारे ट्रांसमिशन जो हमारा ओरल ट्रेडिशन है नॉलेज ट्रांसमिशन का, मुझे याद है हमारे जो पिता या हमारे जो ग्रैंडफादर थे वो कहते थे बेटा पढ़ लो. क्यों पढ़ लो? वो कहते थे कि अगर तुम पढ़ लोगे तो तुम एक ऐसा धन प्राप्त कर लोगे जिसको कोई न तुम्हारा भाई बांट सकता है, न तुम्हारा कोई मित्र बांट सकता है, न कोई और बांट सकता है. और सारे धन बांटे जा सकते हैं. आपकी प्रॉपर्टी बढ़ सकती है, आपकी लैंड बढ़ सकती है, आपके अन्य साधन बढ़ सकते हैं, लेकिन विद्या एक ऐसा धन है जिसको आप बांटना चाहें बांट सकते हैं, लेकिन फिर भी वो धन आपके पास ही रहेगा. उस धन में वृद्धि होगी तो वो आपके पास ही होगा. और अगर आप इसको थोड़ा वाइडर पर्सपेक्टिव में देखें, जो भारत की अपनी एक विचार है, एक अपनी आइडियोलॉजी है, तो आज जो पूरा विश्व ये कह रहा है दैट वी आर in fact all other sources have been replaced by knowledge, they have been overpowered by knowledge. So it will not be wrong to agree with that, क्योंकि आज हम ये कह रहे हैं that we are a knowledge driven society, that we are living in a knowledge economy. So whether you call it a knowledge economy or a knowledge driven society, meaning is the same, that all other sources of wealth, whether land or labor or capital, they have rather been overtaken by knowledge. So knowledge is the best source of change. Knowledge is the best source of development. Knowledge is the best source of not only the development of the individual, but also of the entire society. Now, at the same time, I would say that Indic, Indology has to work in such a manner that it becomes inclusive in nature. So we must work for inclusive Indology. And there must be some kind of a marriage between classical Indology and the modern Indology. Until unless they are married together, perhaps there shall remain some kind of a gap in understanding in totality the contributions of India and also the capabilities and the intellectual potentialities of India as a nation for future as well. So I would say that Indology has to work for some kind of a inclusive research and inclusive development. In fact, I must also say that Indology must help rediscover India's rich past and at the same time trigger a cultural awakening. It must enable India to imbibe and assimilate modernity without letting go of its cultural roots. From Vidyasagar to Vivekananda and Tagore to Mahatma Gandhi, one finds that the socio-cultural modernization of India was built upon a foundation that emphasized an organic synthesis of the Eastern and Western thought was Professor Pranjape was saying that we must not close our doors for what is good outside India, and at the same time, we must not condemn everything that is Indian. Unfortunately, the negativities against what India has to contribute to the world are getting rather precedence over what we are saying. We have never been close to the outside world. आज भी हम ये कहते हैं कि जो अपना है उसको युगानुकूल बनाइए और जो बाहर का है उसे देशानुकूल बनाइए. माने ये है that everything there should be some kind of a reinterpretation of what we have. और आज का जो इंडोलॉजी है उसको हमें देखना होगा कि वो किस तरीके से हमारी अंडरस्टैंडिंग को और आगे बढ़ाता है, कल्चरल अंडरस्टैंडिंग को भी और हमारे पास्ट की अंडरस्टैंडिंग को भी. एज प्रोफेसर प्रांजपे ने जब इंट्रोडक्टरी अपनी स्पीच दी थी तो उन्होंने कहा था देयर इज अ नीड फॉर इंटरप्रेटिंग, reinterpreting to deepen our understanding of India as well as of the world. So, हमको जो इंडियन लेंसेज हैं उनको उतारना नहीं है और वर्ल्ड लेंसेज को हमें तोड़ना नहीं है. इसलिए अगर हम इसमें कहीं सही प्रयास करेंगे तो शायद कुछ अच्छी जगह पर पहुंचेंगे. जो रिसर्च मेथोडोलॉजीज जिसकी चर्चा प्रोफेसर प्रांत पे बार बार कर रहे हैं, मुझे लगता है कि वो अगर अच्छी है, आर्कियोलॉजी का मैं एक एग्जांपल देना यहाँ पर उचित समझूंगा. घग्गर और हाकरा का जो रिमोट सेंसिंग से हमको पता चला, उसने हमारी अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ द हड़प्पन सिविलाइजेशन हैज चेंज्ड. So therefore, the archaeology has its own role to play, which is a part of the knowledge tradition. And therefore, I must say that somewhere it has to be built upon our past with the eye on the present and also with the aim of reshaping the future India. So until unless we do it, I think we will not be very much moving forward. At the same time, I would say that the rediscovery of the aspects of ancient Indian wisdom, can solve many of our contemporary problems. And therefore, we must take pride, whatever is we are doing it. Yoga, Ayurveda, and other 6 branches, in mathematics, India's contribution is no less. Algebra, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, biology, astrology, logic, so many other branches, where India's contribution is seminal, phenomenal. And therefore, the Indology must focus on finding out and disseminating knowledge as to how Indian knowledge has contributed into these branches of knowledge. There are Vedangas, And therefore, I would say that somewhere the Indology must reorient itself. It must not be biased and it should not be prejudiced against the West and against the East also. There has to be a happy marriage, between the East and the West. That is what I wanted to say. And at the same time, we must also focus on finding out the significance of India's ancient knowledge in contemporary life. We must situate the past to not only explain the past, but also pave the way for a good, prosperous, healthy, and the kind of a world leader, as I must say. So if we desire for being a world leader in knowledge generation, there's nothing harm, there's nothing wrong. We must, every nation has a right to contribute to the knowledge. And if they make certain good contributions, they must take pride in that. And India is no exception to that. It should not be an exception to that. So we must not be, some kind of sometimes we suffer from some inferiority complex. जो 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 कल्चरल इंपीरियलिज्म है उसका असर इतना कई बार हो जाता है that we develop some kind of the inferiority complex. India has no reason to suffer from that inferiority complex. Rather, we must develop those competencies, those capabilities, and intellectual inquiry, we must be more concerned and competent. India has a very strong and robust tradition of intellectual inquiry. That India should not allow that tradition of intellectual inquiry to weaken. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think your call for an inclusive and holistic Indology is very pertinent because, unfortunately, not only is the field divided between the ancients. I mean, people who study what we may, when we say Indic studies or Indology, we usually mean people who study, our ancient texts and traditions. And the contemporary study of India has been relegated to area studies, and that creates another set of distortions with developmentalists and economists and political theorists and others who, in their own ways, have contributed to the sort of schisms that we have discussed. So, thank you, sir, for that very welcome set of, should I say, recommendations of how the field should go. I'd now like to invite Professor Madhav Hada. हरा साहब हमारे अध्येता भी हैं और हिंदी के वरिष्ठ चिंतक, लेखक और अध्यापक भी हैं, प्राध्यापक भी हैं। तो हरा साहब, आप अपने विचार कृपया व्यक्त कीजिए।
सम्माननीय निदेशक जी, संगोष्ठी के सहभागी मित्रों, अध्येता मित्रों, मैं बुनियादी तौर पर साहित्य का विद्यार्थी हूं, लेकिन क्योंकि पिछले कुछ वर्षों से प्राचीन और मध्यकालीन साहित्य पर काम कर रहा हूं, इसलिए इस अनुशासन में मेरी दिलचस्पी बढ़ती ही गई। सबसे पहले मैं एक बात की ओर आपका ध्यान आकृष्ट करना चाहता हूं, जिसकी ओर पिछली संगोष्ठी में भी सम्माननीय निदेशक जी ने कहा था और इस संगोष्ठी के आरंभ में भी कहा था। इंडोलॉजी या भारत विद्या इस संज्ञा के लिए हमें कोई नए नाम का प्रस्ताव करना चाहिए। इस संज्ञा के साथ बहुत सारी औपनिवेशिक स्मृतियां और संस्कार जुड़े हुए हैं और वर्षों तक ये विद्या, इंडोलॉजी, भारतीय समाज और संस्कृति को समझने में, इंडोलॉजी की स्थापनाएं, इंडोलॉजी की धारणाएं और इंडोलॉजी के विचार वर्षों तक भारतीय समाज और संस्कृति को समझने में अंतर्बाधा की तरह काम करती रही है। इसलिए इस अनुशासन के लिए किसी नए नाम की संज्ञा का प्रस्ताव किया जाए तो बेहतर होगा। दूसरी बात की ओर मैं आपका ध्यान आकृष्ट करना चाहता हूं, वो है भारतीय ज्ञान के पुनरुत्थान की मुहिम आजादी से पहले भी शुरू हुई थी और बहुत सघनता पूर्वक शुरू हुई थी। विडंबना यह है कि ये मुहिम वहीं ठहर गई आजादी के तत्काल बाद। महात्मा गांधी और राष्ट्रीय आंदोलन में शामिल बहुत सारे विद्वानों की राय थी कि पराधीनता से मुक्ति का आशय केवल राजनीतिक किस्म की स्वतंत्रता नहीं है, प्रशासनिक किस्म की स्वतंत्रता नहीं है, बल्कि यूरोपीय और पश्चिमी प्रकार के ज्ञान के वर्चस्व से मुक्ति भी उसमें शामिल है। उन्होंने भारतीय ज्ञान के पुनरुत्थान की मुहिम शुरू की, जिसमें महात्मा गांधी की पहल सर्वोपरि थी। रविन्द्रनाथ टैगोर भी शामिल हुए, के मुंशी भी शामिल हुए, बहुत सारे विद्वान शामिल हुए और उन्होंने बहुत सारी संस्थाएं कायम की जिनमें गुजरात विद्यापीठ, भारतीय विद्या भवन, काशी हिंदू विश्वविद्यालय, राजस्थान प्राच्य विद्या प्रतिष्ठान, और इन संस्थाओं ने बहुत सारा महत्वपूर्ण काम किया। इन मनीषियों ने, राष्ट्रीय आंदोलन में शामिल इन विद्वानों ने बहुत सारे देशज सरोकारों वाले विद्वानों को इन कामों के लिए निमंत्रित भी किया। आज हम उनमें से बहुत सारे लोगों के अवदान को नहीं जानते। मुनि जिन विजय, विधुशेखर शास्त्री, क्षितिमोहन सेन, मोती चंद, गौरीशंकर हीराचंद ओझा, श्यामल दास, इन लोगों ने, ये देशज सरोकारों वाले लोग थे, इनकी कोई औपचारिक शिक्षा नहीं हुई थी, और इन्होंने बहुत सारा महत्वपूर्ण काम भारतीय प्राचीन साहित्य के, प्राचीन ज्ञान के संरक्षण का किया। अकेले मुनि जिन विजय ने लगभग 400 ग्रंथ विभिन्न ग्रंथागारों से बाहर निकाले, उनका शोध और अनुसंधान किया, उनका पाठ संपादन किया। ऐसे बहुत सारे विद्वानों थे। लेकिन विडंबना यह है कि आजादी के तत्काल बाद यूरोपीय ढंग की, औपनिवेशिक ढंग की शिक्षा प्राप्त विद्वानों की एक पूरी पीढ़ी ने इस पीढ़ी को बेदखल कर दिया, और इन विद्वानों ने जो काम किया उसका आकलन और मूल्यांकन नहीं हुआ, और आज इनमें से बहुत सारे विद्वानों के नाम भी हम नहीं जानते। एक तीसरी बात की ओर मैं आपका ध्यान आकृष्ट करना चाहता हूं। रविन्द्रनाथ टैगोर ने एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण बात कही थी कि सब खेतों में एक जैसी फसलें नहीं होती। ये बात हमें, आरंभिक इंडोलॉजी के जितने विद्वान थे वे इस तथ्य से अवगत नहीं थे, वे इस बारे में नहीं जानते थे। एक यूरोपीय इतिहास, इतिहास की एक यूरोपीय दृष्टि का विकास हुआ, और धीरे धीरे वो इतिहास दृष्टि सार्वभौमिक भी हो गई। हम अपने समाज को, अपनी संस्कृति को, अपनी विरासत को उसी इतिहास दृष्टि से समझने का प्रयास भी करते रहे। विडंबना यह है कि इस इतिहास दृष्टि के विकल्प में एक भारतीय इतिहास दृष्टि का प्रस्ताव हम आज भी नहीं कर पाए। ये इतिहास दृष्टि कमोबेश 18वीं शताब्दी में विकसित हुई, और ये इतिहास दृष्टि यूरोपीय सांस्कृतिक और सामाजिक जरूरतों के तहत बनी थी। उसमें यूरोपीय समाज और संस्कृति की भूमिका निर्णायक थी। हमारा समाज, हमारी संस्कृति उस समाज और संस्कृति से बहुत भिन्न प्रकार की थी। हमारी अपने समाज और संस्कृति के अनुसार भी बहुत सारे इतिहास रूप संभव हुए थे। एक इतिहास दृष्टि भी परंपरा से हमारे पास थी। लेकिन विडंबना यह है कि हम अपने समाज और अपने साहित्य का मूल्यांकन उस यूरोपीय दृष्टि से करते रहे। मुझे लगता है मार्क ब्लॉक ने एक बात कही थी जिसकी और कम लोगों का ध्यान गया। मार्क ब्लॉक प्रमुख इतिहासकार थे यूरोपीय। उन्होंने कहा था, ईसाइयत इतिहासकारों का धर्म है, और यही इतिहास दृष्टि सार्वभौमिक इतिहास दृष्टि की तरह आज भी काम कर रही है। विडंबना यह है, मुझे लगता है कि हर समाज की अपनी सांस्कृतिक और सामाजिक जरूरतों के तहत इतिहास रूप संभव होते हैं। जैसे हमारे अपनी सांस्कृतिक और सामाजिक जरूरतों के तहत ख्यात, बही, पाठनामा, रास, रासो, भक्तमाल, पर्ची, ऐसे बहुत सारे इतिहास रूप, बहुत सारे धर्माख्यान संभव हुए। विडंबना यह है कि इस सार्वभौमिक इतिहास दृष्टि को केंद्र में रखकर, इसको आधार बनाकर हमने अपने इन इतिहास रूपों को अप्रामाणिक और अपर्याप्त सिद्ध कर दिया, और ये आज भी चला आ रहा है। जनश्रुतियां और मिथक हमारे सामाजिक और सांस्कृतिक व्यवहार का हिस्सा थे, लेकिन इस औपनिवेशिक इतिहास दृष्टि के कारण हमने उनको भी बेदखल और खारिज कर दिया। हम अपने साहित्य का मूल्यांकन करते समय, अपने समाज का संस्कृति का मूल्यांकन करते समय हम आज भी उनको निगाह में नहीं ले रहे। एक अंतिम बात जिसकी ओर ध्यान आकृष्ट करना चाहता हूं मैं आपका, मुझे लगता है कि भारतीय समाज बहुत विविध प्रकार का समाज है। आरंभिक भारतीय विद्या ने सार्वदेशिक धारणाओं का प्रस्ताव किया भारतीय समाज और संस्कृति के संबंध में। सार्वदेशिक स्थापनाओं और धारणाओं का यह प्रस्ताव हमारे समाज को समझने के लिए, हमारी संस्कृति को समझने के लिए, जो बहुत विविध प्रकार की थी, बहुत अप्रासंगिक और अपर्याप्त प्रकार का था। मुझे लगता है इतने सांस्कृतिक वैविध्य को उन सार्वदेशिक धारणाओं और स्थापनाओं के आधार पर समझना बहुत मुश्किल काम था। मैं दो उदाहरण दूंगा। जैसे सामंतवाद, मुझे लगता है यूरोपीय सामंतवाद की तर्ज पर हमारे आरंभिक विद्वानों ने और भारत विद्या में शामिल आरंभिक विद्वानों ने कुछ प्रस्ताव किए, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि भारतीय सामंतवाद में इतनी क्षेत्रीय भिन्नताएं थी। वो बंगाल में अलग था, वो मध्य भारत में अलग था, वो दक्षिण भारत में अलग था, वो राजस्थान में इन सब से अलग था। लेकिन हमने इस सारे सामंतवाद को एक ही नजरिए से, एक ही दृष्टिकोण से समझना शुरू किया और हमने मान लिया कि उसमें मनुष्यता के लिए जगह निरंतर कम है और वो अमानवीय है, अन्यायपूर्ण है। जबकि हमारे सामंतवाद के बहुत सारे रूप थे जो अलग अलग प्रकार के थे। कुछ सामंतवाद के ऐसे रूप थे जहां मनुष्य होने के लिए जगह थी, अन्याय भी नहीं था, शोषण भी नहीं था, दासता भी नहीं थी, और बहुत सारी चीजें हैं जिनमें एक और मॉडल जो आरंभिक मनुष्यों ने लागू किया, आरंभिक भारत विद्या के एंडोलॉजी के विद्वानों ने लागू किया, वो सती प्रथा का उनका जो अनुभव था बंगाल का था। विडंबना यह है कि ये अनुभव सारे भारतवर्ष पर लागू कर दिया उन्होंने। जैसे सती प्रथा बंगाल में लगभग अपरिहार्य रही होगी, स्वैच्छिक भी नहीं होगी, लेकिन ये राजस्थान और गुजरात में नहीं था। इस तरह की बहुत सारी चीजें हैं जो मुझे लगता है कि आरंभिक भारतीय विद्या में शामिल रही। आरंभिक भारतीय विद्या ने इन्हीं का प्रस्ताव किया और विडंबना ये है कि ये हैंगओवर आज भी जारी है। आज भी इस देश और समाज को समझने वाले लोग, विडंबना ये है कि हमारे बहुत सारे वामपंथी विद्वान और औपनिवेशिक विद्वान एक ही दिशा में सोच रहे थे, एक ही दिशा में कार्य कर रहे थे भारतीय समाज के समझने के लिए। भारतीय समाज और संस्कृति को समझने के लिए बहुत जरूरी है कि हम सबसे पहले हम अपनी एक इतिहास दृष्टि का, जो सर्वथा हमारी सामाजिक सांस्कृतिक जरूरतों से बनी हो, उसका प्रस्ताव करें, उसकी रूपरेखा तैयार करें और हमारे समाज और संस्कृति को उस इतिहास दृष्टि के आधार पर समझने की कोशिश करें। इस इतिहास दृष्टि में हमारे सारे वे ग्रंथ, हमारे वे सारे दस्तावेज, स्मृति को निरंतर संरक्षित करने का हमारा अपना ढंग, स्मृति के संरक्षण और सुरक्षा का हमारा जो अपना ढंग है, हमारा जो अपना तरीका है, उसका भी उसमें ध्यान रखें। और इस तरह की बहुत सारी बातें हैं जो मुझे लगता है कि ध्यान में रखनी चाहिए। स्मृति के संरक्षण का एक हमारा भारतीय ढंग भी है। हम स्मृति को कभी लिखित में ले जाते हैं, लिखित को वापस श्रुत में लाते हैं और निरंतर ये आवाजाही चलती रहती है और सदियों तक हम अपनी स्मृति को निरंतर जीवंत रखते हैं, उसे ठहरने नहीं देते, उसे दस्तावेज नहीं बनने देते। ये एक भारतीय ढंग है जिसके आधार पर हम अपने समाज और संस्कृति को एक नई इतिहास दृष्टि से समझने का प्रयास कर सकते हैं। मैं माननीय निदेशक जी के प्रति कृतज्ञ हूँ कि उन्होंने मुझे अपनी बात कहने का अवसर दिया। धन्यवाद।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद खड़ा साहब। जब हम अलग अलग दृष्टिकोणों की बात करते हैं भारत विद्या को लेकर के, तब मुझे हमेशा लगा है कि एक दृष्टिकोण है जिसको हम एक देसीवाद का नाम भी दे सकते हैं, जिसमें एक बहुत हम कह सकते हैं गंभीर संशय है विदेशी मापदंडों पर। अपने आप को समझने के लिए जब हम विदेशी मापदंडों को अपनाते हैं, इसके प्रति एक गंभीर और गहरा संशय है देसीवादियों में, जो मुझे लग रहा है। और वो हमेशा स्व और परा, इनके बीच का जो हम कहेंगे टक्कर है, इनके बीच की जो टक्कर है या संघर्ष है, इसको एक हम कह सकते हैं एक वैषम्य, हम कह सकते हैं वैषम्य या व्यतिरेक के, यानी कॉन्ट्रास्टिव मेथोडोलॉजी, वो उसका रूप या प्रतिमा उनके दिमाग में कॉन्ट्रास्टिव होती है हमेशा, कि वहां ये है, हमारे यहाँ ये है। वो इब्राहिमिक है, हम सनातनी हैं। वो इस तरह हैं, हम इस तरह हैं। और इससे बहुत कुछ निकलता है, मैं मना नहीं कर रहा हूं, लेकिन हम इसमें कभी कभी पूरी तरह से ग्रस्त हो जाते हैं, इससे हम बाहर नहीं निकल पाते कि कोई एक डायलॉजिक या संवादिक, जैसे आज सुबह इन्होंने कहा था, क्रिस चैपल ने, किसी ने उनको पूछा कि आप जैन धर्म पढ़ाते हैं लेकिन संदर्भ तो वहां बिल्कुल ही और है, कहाँ, अमेरिका में। तो उन्होंने जवाब दिया, अमेरिका में कई तरह के लोग हैं, और मैं नहीं मानता कि हम सब जो इंसान है या मनुष्य है, हमें इतना अंतर है। तो जिसको हम कल्चर या संस्कृति कहते हैं, सभ्यता कहते हैं, वो कोई इतना बड़ा उससे अंतर नहीं निर्माण होता। और वो कह रहे हैं कि अमेरिका एक समास है, हर एक जगह से लोग यहाँ आए हैं, और विभिन्न संस्कृतियों के प्रति एक बहुत ही उदार और ओपन, जो कहते हैं खुला रवैया रखते हैं अमेरिका में। इसलिए मुझे जैन धर्म पढ़ाने में यहाँ कोई मुश्किल नहीं आती। क्या हम इस तरह उल्टा कर सकते हैं भारत में? कोई भारतीय यहूदी धर्म के बारे में सीखना चाहेगा? हम तो अपने आप में ही इतने मग्न हो चुके हैं, हम किसी और का कोई चीज समझने की कोशिश नहीं कर रहे हैं। भारत में अब जो देखो, चीन की इतनी बड़ी हमारे आगे समस्या है, खतरा भी है। साइनोलॉजिस्ट भारत ने कितने निर्माण किए हैं, दो तीन इंस्टीट्यूट है, लेकिन कोई नई सोच तो निर्माण नहीं हुई हमारे यहाँ। अफ्रीका को हम अच्छी तरह समझ नहीं पाए। दूसरों के प्रति हमारा कौतूहल भी बहुत ही निम्न है, ऐसे मुझे लगता है। तो कहने का मतलब ये है कि अगर हम, मैं तो बल्कि क्रिस को ये कहने वाला था कि विदेश में, खास करके अमेरिका में, भारत के बारे में ज्यादा हम अच्छी तरह से समझ पाते हैं। आपको भरतनाट्यम सीखना है, यहाँ पे आपको टीचर मिलना मुश्किल होगा। आप लॉस एंजलिस या न्यूयॉर्क में रहेंगे, आपके बच्चों को सर्वोत्तम वहां शिक्षा प्रदान हो सकती है। संस्कृत भी सीखेंगे और मैथमेटिक्स भी वहां सीखेंगे। यानी हम दोनों तरफ के पिछड़े हैं, वो दोनों तरफ से आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। ये कुछ वस्तु स्थिति है जिसके बारे में मुझे गहरी चिंता होती है, कि हम संकीर्ण होते जा रहे हैं और वो दुनिया भर की चीजों को सीख के आत्मसात करके कहीं आगे चले जा रहे हैं। लेकिन हाँ, कुछ संशय होना भी चाहिए। लेकिन ये जो कॉन्ट्रास्टिव मॉडल है, जो वैषम्य का जो प्रारूप है एक दूसरे को समझने के लिए, वो मेरे ख्याल से वो एक हद तक ही हमें ले जाता है। और ये हम अक्सर, मैं आजकल देखता हूँ इसी चीजों के बारे में, कि हमारा सामंतवाद अलग था, हमारी व्यवस्था अलग थी, हमारी संस्कृति अलग थी। हाँ, हो सकता है, मैं ये नहीं कह रहा हूं कि भिन्नता नहीं है, बहुत भिन्नता है। लेकिन क्या हम वो मापदंड, वो प्रारूप, वो प्रतिमाएं, क्या हम उनका आविष्कार कर पाए हैं? हमारे, हमने सामंतवाद, आपने जो प्रश्न, जो सॉरी शब्द इस्तेमाल किया, शब्द प्रयोग जो किया हरा साहब, ये तो सिर्फ अनुवाद है। फ्यूडलिज्म का आपने अनुवाद कर दिया। हमारे यहाँ कोई शब्द है? शब्दावली, अफसोसन हमारी सारी की सारी, हमारी शब्दावली बाहर से हमने निर्यात की है या आयात की है, और हम उसी के आधार पे उसका अनुवाद करके हम कहते हैं ये हमारे यहाँ नहीं है। हमने कोई अपनी सब शब्दावली बनाई है, भारत में बनाई है पिछले 100-150 साल में, मुझे नहीं लगता। जहां तक मेरी समझ है, मुझे लगता है इसके बारे में हमको बहुत गंभीरता सोचना चाहिए। हम अपनी शब्दावली ठीक से नहीं बना पाए, जो पुरानी शब्दावली है वो हम ठीक से उसको परिवर्तित और प्रासंगिक भी नहीं बना पाए हैं पूरी तरह से। हालांकि हाँ, मैं ये कहूंगा कि जो हमारा स्वतंत्रता युद्ध था तब हमने किया, ये शब्द स्वतंत्रता, ये एक बहुत ही टेक्निकल शब्द है जो कश्मीर शहर दर्शन से आता है। स्वराज की भी हमने बात की थी। ऐसे कुछ शब्दों को छोड़ करके बाकी सारी शब्दावली हमारी इंपोर्टेड है, सिर्फ हमने उसको अनुवाद किया है। तो अनुवादित, जैसे हम कहते हैं, हम एक अनुवादित आधुनिकता है हमारी, है ना। ये अनुवादिक आधुनिकता से हमें बाहर निकालना है कि एक ऑथेंटिक जो हम कहेंगे, ये आधुनिकता के तरह हम धीरे धीरे बढ़ रहे हैं, है ना। हम ठीक से उसको कर नहीं पाए हैं। मैं कहूँगा उस ऑथेंटिसिटी या उस विश्वसनीयता की तरफ हम बढ़ रहे हैं, और अभी वो हम प्राधिकृत नहीं कर पाए, अफसोसन। हालांकि बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद बड़ा साहब, आपने मुझे एकदम क्या कहें, चिंतित कर दिया एक तरह से। थैंक यू सो मच। मैं बलराम शुक्ल जी को आमंत्रित करता हूं अपनी बात रखने के लिए, और उसके बाद हमारे पास कुछ समय रहेगा, 10-15 मिनट, तब हम इसको खुलेआम इसकी चर्चा कर पाएंगे। धन्यवाद बलराम जी।
आदरणीय निदेशक महोदय तथा उपस्थित समस्त विद्वद्वृंद, भारत विद्या के क्षेत्र में जो शोध हो रहे हैं उनकी नवीन दिशाएं, इस विषय पर हम बड़े महत्वपूर्ण विद्वानों के विचार निरंतर सुन रहे हैं कल से। और भारत विद्या शब्द की इस क्षेत्र की जो गंभीरता है, इसका जो विस्तार है, उसको भी हम समझ रहे हैं। इस तरह से ये अनेक सहस्राब्दियों में विकसित, अनेक भाषाओं में लिखी गई, अनेक प्रकार के साहित्यों में संचित जो ज्ञान विज्ञान है, उसके अध्ययन के विषय में है। और वो केवल प्राचीन ही नहीं, मध्यकालीन ही नहीं, आधुनिकता से भी उसका पूरा उतना ही सरोकार है जितना कि वो प्राचीन में जितनी वो साबित कदम है, जितना उसका जड़ प्राचीनता में है, उतना ही वो आधुनिकता में भी है। और आज कल की जो चर्चाएं हैं इंडोलॉजी को लेकर के, वो खुद इस बात की गवाह हैं कि वो आधुनिक विश्व के लिए, वर्तमान काल के लिए कितनी महत्वपूर्ण। आज जो हम इस विषय पर विशेष रूप से चर्चा करेंगे बहुत सीमित समय में, वो इंडोलॉजी के जो हकदार हैं, जो उसके विरासतदार हैं, उनको हम दो तरह से, दो मुख्य भागों में बांट करके देख सकते हैं। एक तो इंडोलॉजी की वाहिका जो भाषाएं हैं, हमारी प्राचीन, मध्यकालीन, इवन जो शुरुआती मध्यकाल की भाषाएं हैं, वे उन वो स्रोत भाषाएं और उन स्रोत भाषाओं के जो तथाकथित रक्षक हैं, जो भारत में जो उनके विभाग हैं, एक तो वे हो गए स्रोतस्वी लोग हो गए। दूसरे जो है वे स्रोत का उपयोग करने वाले, जो विभिन्न पर्सपेक्टिव्स, कॉन्टेक्स्ट्स और मेथोडोलॉजी का उपयोग करके उन स्रोतों को जो एक्सप्लॉइट करते हैं, स्रोतों का जो उपयोग करते हैं अपने विभिन्न चर्चाओं के। तो हम अगर देखें भारत में इन स्रोत विभागों की क्या स्थिति है, चूंकि मेरा संबंध संस्कृत विभाग से है, फारसी विभाग से रहा है, मैं छात्र रहा हूं वहां का, तो इस विषय पर मैं ये विषय अत्यंत चिंतनीय होता है कि कोई भी ज्ञान परंपरा भाषा के द्वारा ही संवाहित होती है, भाषा उसकी वाहिका होती है। इसलिए वे विभाग जो कि इन भाषाओं की शिक्षा देते हैं, उनकी क्या स्थिति है, ये हमें समझनी होती है। इसका सीधा सीधा मतलब ये होता है उन विभागों में स्थिति को देख करके कि हमारे पास जो स्रोत को वास्तविक रूप में स्थित रखने वाले लोग हैं, क्या वे इतने समर्थ हैं? भारत में प्राचीन काल से ही, वेदों के समय से ही ये बात, इसकी चिंता व्यक्त की गई है कि हमारी निधि की सुरक्षा होनी चाहिए किसी भी कीमत पर। क्योंकि आप हम अक्सर चर्चा कर रहे हैं कि हम अक्सर चर्चा करते हैं कि हमारी जो ज्ञान विज्ञान है वो केवल सुरक्षित ही नहीं रहने चाहिए, उसका वर्तमान संदर्भ में भी उपयोग भी होना चाहिए। लेकिन उपयोग की चर्चा जो है वो सेकेंडरी है, यद्यपि बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है, लेकिन वो द्वितीयक है। प्राथमिक क्या है? प्राथमिक ये है कि इन स्रोतों की सुरक्षा होनी चाहिए। इसलिए वेदों में ये प्रार्थना है, निधिम में गोपाय श्रुतम में गोपाय। और मनुस्मृति में एक पैराबल आता है कि विद्या ब्राह्मण में त्याह सेवधिष्ठे स्मिरक्षमाम। मैं विद्या ब्राह्मण के पास आई और उसने कहा कि मैं तुम्हारा खजाना हूं, मेरी सुरक्षा करो तुम। इसके पहले भी ब्राह्मण ग्रंथों में ये पैराबल आता है। तो हम देखते हैं, अगर नजर उठा करके और विवेचना पूर्वक, तो हम देखते हैं कि संस्कृत विभाग हों, संस्कृत के लोग हों, प्राकृत के लोग हों, अपभ्रंश के लोग हैं हों, या फारसी के लोग हों, जो विभागों में विद्वान हैं, वो किस तरह से परस्पर संकुचित हैं। संकीर्णता जो है, वो पारस्परिक इंटरेक्शन का अभाव जो है, उसके नाते उनका ज्ञान अत्यंत संकुचित हो चुका है। ये उनका आंतरिक दोष है, और ये बहुत बड़ा दोष है, क्योंकि प्रज्ञा विवेकम लभते भिन्नैरागम दर्शनैः। प्रज्ञा को विवेक यानी बुद्धि में विविधता तभी आती है, पावर ऑफ डिस्कशन तभी आता है, जब हम विभिन्न आगम शास्त्रों के साथ अपने को संबद्ध करें। आप जो प्राच्य विद्या वाले हैं, वो दूसरे विभागों से संपृक्त होने की बात छोड़ दीजिए, उनके अपने जो पारस्परिक विभाग हैं, उनमें पारस्परिकता, परस्पर संपर्क बहुत ही कम होता है। ये बहुत ही दुख की बात है। फारसी और संस्कृत और प्राकृत की बात ही छोड़ दीजिए। आजादी के शुरू में हम लोगों ने ये सोचा था कि प्राकृत अपभ्रंश जो है सब लोग पढ़ेंगे, इसलिए सारे संस्कृत विभागों का नाम संस्कृत तथा प्राकृत विभाग था। और संस्कृत, लेकिन ऐसा हुआ नहीं। हिंदी वालों ने भी छोड़ा और संस्कृत वालों में नहीं छोड़ा। तो ये इनका आंतरिक दोष है, लेकिन पूरा दोष आंतरिक नहीं है। ये वस्तुतः उसमें बहुत बड़े ऐतिहासिक, सामाजिक और आर्थिक कारण हैं। जो प्राचीन विद्या है, प्राच्य विद्या है, विशेष रूप से संस्कृत, उसको या फारसी, उसको कृत्रिम जो हमारे समाज में संरचित विमर्श चले हैं, उन विमर्शों के पूर्वाग्रहों के कारण के प्रति जो दृष्टि है, या उन विद्या के अध्येताओं के प्रति जो दृष्टि है, वो अच्छी नहीं है भारतवर्ष में। ये हमें मानना पड़ेगा। और वो अविकसित दृष्टि, एक बहुत बड़ा कारण आर्थिक कारण भी है कि और आर्थिक सामाजिक कारण है। हमारा देश किस तरह से परतंत्रता से, हजारों साल की परतंत्रता से उभरा है, और किस प्रकार वो उसमें हीनता गंड जिसको कहते हैं वो है, और उसके कारण जो वर्नाक्युलर लैंग्वेजेस में, जो क्षेत्रीय भाषाओं में विद्वत्ता है, उसके प्रति एक हीनता की दृष्टि है। अंग्रेजी के प्रति एक अतिरिक्त और अस्वाभाविक श्रेष्ठता की दृष्टि जो है, वो सर्वत्र है। संभवतः भारत कभी ऐसा समय हो कि क्षेत्रीय भाषाओं में अर्जित ज्ञान की भी थोड़ी सी कद्र हो, लेकिन वस्तुतः वो कद्र है नहीं। तो एक ये पूर्वाग्रह जो हैं, बहुत सारे विचित्र प्रकार के पूर्वाग्रह जो हैं, संस्कृत जो है किसी एक विषय विशेष से संबद्ध, या फारसी जो है वो किसी एक जाति विशेष या संस्कृति विशेष से संबद्ध है। भारत में कुछ लोग हैं जो ये मानते हैं कि हमारा प्राचीन था, वही सब कुछ ठीक हुआ। एक ऐसा वर्ग है जो कहता है कि जब मुस्लिमों का आक्रमण हुआ, उसी के बाद से यहाँ से जमाना जहालत जो था वो खत्म हुआ, यहाँ दीने मुबीन इस्लाम आया और उसके साथ बहुत अच्छे दिन आ गए। और तीसरे तरह के लोग ऐसे हैं कि पुराना जो कुछ था वो सब दकियानूसी था, अंग्रेजों ने आकर के सब ठीक किया वगैरह वगैरह। तो इस तरह की जो खंडित दृष्टि है, जो कृत्रिम संरचनाएं हैं, वे हमारी इन भाषाओं के अध्ययन को और भाषाओं के अध्येताओं के प्रति एक बहुत ही बुरा सा एक दृश्य प्रस्तुत करती हैं, और वो पूरे समाज में व्याप्त है। दूसरी चीज हम देखें, जो इन स्रोतों का उपयोग करने वाले लोग हैं, वे निश्चित रूप से बहुत बड़ा काम कर रहे हैं, और वस्तुतः इन इन विद्याओं के पढ़ने का तात्पर्य यही है कि इनका उपयोग किया जाए, अन्यथा खत्म ज्ञानम क्रियाम विना, ज्ञान जो है वो अगर उसको उसका एप्लीकेशन न हो तो वो मृत है। लेकिन प्रॉब्लम ये है कि पर्सपेक्टिव, कॉन्टेक्स्ट और ये जो विमर्श हैं उसको इतना अधिक महत्व दिया जाता है कि टेक्स्ट जो है वो पीछे रह जाता है। हम पहले ये समझें तो कि टेक्स्ट क्या कह रहा है, और उसके लिए हम अपनी विभागों को, आवश्यक नहीं है कि हम मोनोपोलाइज कर दें कि संस्कृत विभाग में जो स्नातक है वही आकर के हमें पढ़ाएगा तभी हम संस्कृत पाएंगे। तो संस्कृत को मुक्त करने की भी बात है, इन चीजों को स्वयं भी मुक्त करने की बात है। एक तरह का आलस्य भी है, एक तरह का अति आंग्ल प्रेम भी है, जिसके नाते हमने कर लिया तो बहुत अच्छा है। तो जैसे कल बात हो रही थी कि मेथोडोलॉजी और पर्सपेक्टिव बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है। तो लेकिन टेक्स्ट अगर नहीं रहेगा तो कॉन्टेक्स्ट आप किसके आधार पर कहेंगे? टेक्स्ट वाहक है उसका, इसको हमें समझना होगा, और कहीं ना कहीं हम उसको नजरअंदाज कर रहे हैं। तो जो हमारे विभाग हैं, जो स्रोत विभाग हैं, वो इंटेंसिव देखते हैं, और ये जो दूसरे लोग हैं स्रोत का उपयोग करने वाले एक्सटेंसिवली देखते हैं। दोनों दृष्टियों का अपना अपना महत्व है, और दोनों में इंटरैक्शन का होना बहुत आवश्यक है। और इस अपूर्ण दृष्टि के कारण और इंटरैक्शन के अभाव के कारण हम बहुत स्तरों पर पारस्परिक जो अंतःक्रिया है उससे विहीन हो जाते हैं, और इंटरैक्शन के नहीं रहने पर हम विचित्र सी से दावे करने लगते हैं। जैसे अमेरिकन ओरिएंटलिस्ट जो हैं, कई नाम लेने की आवश्यकता नहीं है, पिछले वर्षों में हमने उनका इंटरव्यू देखा था। उनका ये कहना था, शेल्डन पॉलक का, कि दिल्ली के बारे में, कि दिल्ली में अब कोई ऐसा विद्वान संस्कृत का नहीं रहा जिसके साथ हम चर्चा कर सकें। तो ये वस्तुतः क्या है? ये मूल स्रोतों से बचने जैसा है। मूल स्रोतों के जो लोग हैं उनसे उनसे इस तरह से देशी संस्कृत विद्वत्ता नष्ट हो गई, ऐसा कहना पतंजलि के शब्दों में साहस मात्रम है। ये आपका साहस है अगर आप ऐसा कह रहे हैं। तो पतंजलि फिर कहते हैं, उपलब्धौ यत्नः क्रियताम, आप उपलब्धि में यत्न करें। और जैसा कि कल निदेशक महोदय कह रहे थे कि बहुत सारे ऐसे विद्वान पश्चिम में, और केवल पश्चिम में नहीं, अब ग्लोबलाइजेशन का दौर है, भी उनके बहुत सारे पृष्ठपोषक ऐसे हैं जो कि ऐसे वे लोग हैं जो कि भारत में निर्वाचित जो सरकार है उसके खिलाफ बोलते हैं। तो अनबायस्ड स्कॉलरशिप और पॉलिटिकल एक्टिविज्म में कोई अंतर ही नहीं रह गया है। तो एक क्रूसेडिंग जैसी चीज हो गई है। और मैंने अभी देखा नई किताब ऑडिटर की वो संस्कृत नैरेटिव ऑफ मुस्लिम पास्ट, उसकी शुरुआत में फैज का एक कोट है, बोल के लब आजाद है तेरे। अब फैज से कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, लेकिन ये जो स्वर है वो कैसा स्वर है? पॉलिटिकल एक्टिविज्म और आप में, एक्टिविस्ट और आप में कोई तो अंतर होना चाहिए, कोई अनबायसनेस तो होना चाहिए। तो हम इनको मान्यता दे रहे हैं, और हम कौन है? भारतीय, जो कि इनके सिपाही बन चुके हैं, जैसा कि अभी निदेशक महोदय ने कहा। तो आवश्यक है कि हम थोड़ा सा परीक्षण करें, परीक्षण के बाद ग्रहण करें। कालिदास ने कहा है कि संतः परीक्षान्य तरत भजन्ते, जो विद्वान होता है वो परीक्षण के बाद ग्रहण करता है, और मूर्ख व्यक्ति जो है वो पर प्रत्ययनीय बुद्धि, दूसरा जैसे उसको समझा देता है वैसा कह देता है। तो हम दूसरों की बात मानने में पर आमादा क्यों है? इसका कारण ये है, मजबूर क्यों है? क्योंकि हमने अपने स्रोतों की सुरक्षा नहीं की है। हमने अपनी निधि का परिपालन नहीं किया है। हमारे लिए केवल पर्सपेक्टिव ही सब कुछ हो चुका है। तो आवर्स नॉट टू रीजन वाई, आवर्स बट टू डू एंड डाई, जैसा टेनिसन कहते हैं कि हमारे लिए तो बस उनका पृष्ठपोषण मात्र है। हमारे अंतिम बात कह के मैं अपने को विराम दूंगा। इतनी चर्चाएं हुई भारत विद्याविदों पर, और एक शताब्दी पूर्व जो अरविंद इत्यादि हुए उन पर बड़ी चर्चा हुई, लेकिन भारत के वे लोग जो भारत विद्या पर कार्य कर रहे हैं और बहुत नवीन शोध कर रहे हैं, पिछली शताब्दियों में जिन्होंने महान काम किए हैं, हम उनके बारे में नहीं जानते हैं। तो हमें आवश्यकता है कि ये समय की आवश्यकता है कि आधुनिक भारतीय विद्याविदों पर हमें विश्वास हो। हम वर्नाक्युलर जो सोर्सेज हैं उनका उपयोग करें। हमारे पास एक एक भाषा जो है, एक एक अद्भुत, जैसे अब मराठी देखिए, कन्नड़ देखिए, पिछली शताब्दी में सेडियापु कृष्ण भट्ट थे जिन्होंने छंदों पर इतना अद्भुत काम किया है, जो अभी संस्कृत में अनुदित हुआ है, जिसको हम अभी पढ़ भी रहे हैं। तो इतना महत्वपूर्ण कार्य है, वो ध्वन्यालोक के बराबर का काम है। हम कितने लोग जानते हैं उसके बारे में। वो तो आधुनिक जो भारतीय कार्य कर रहे हैं उनको केवल नेगेटिव रिएक्शन नहीं माना जाए, उनको ध्यान से और बहुत ही सहानुभूति पूर्वक देखा जाए। और मैं तो कहता हूं कि क्षोभ अगर उनके में है तो किसी कारण से है। और कालिदास का कहना है, प्रायः स्वम महिमानम क्षोभात प्रतिपद्यते ही जनः। वो क्षोभ बहुत ही अच्छी बात है। क्षोभ के बाद व्यक्ति अपने महत्व में प्रतिष्ठित होता है। तो हम देखें, सेडियापु कृष्ण भट्ट, आर गणेश ने बहुत सुंदर चीजें की हैं। शंकर राजारामन ने एक सीरीज ऑफ पेपर्स लिखे हैं जिसमें शेल्डन पोलक के संस्कृत संबंधी अनुवादों का में दोष दिखाया है, और सिर्फ दोष नहीं दिखाया है कि ये बताया कि वस्तुतः अनुवाद क्या होना चाहिए। नित्यानंद इत्यादि बहुत सारे लोग हैं। मैं समय से अधिक नहीं बोलना चाहता। मुझे समय दिया गया, अवसर दिया गया, इसके लिए मैं निदेशक महोदय का बहुत अधिक आभारी हूँ।
धन्यवाद बलराम जी, आपने 4-5 चीजें उठाई, बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है और इस पे चर्चा जरूर हो सकी है। खास करके आपने शेल्डन पोलक का नाम भी ले लिया, अच्छी बात है। हम यहाँ पे किसी को ये नहीं कहेंगे ही हू शैल नॉट बी नेम, जो कि हैरी पॉटर में कहा जाता है वोल्डेमॉर्ट के बारे में। लेकिन मतलब ऑब्वियसली हम जोकिंग, कहने का मतलब ये है कि जिन्होंने कुछ यहाँ पे लिखा, गणेशन जी वैसे शतावधानी गणेश और ये सब, ये कोई एकेडमी का हिस्सा नहीं है। ज्यादातर ये बाहर से लोग करते हैं। नित्यानंद तिवारी जी भी कोई किसी संस्कृत विभाग में नहीं है, वो किसी बैंक में काम करते हैं। खैर, हम इसको अभी छोड़ते हैं। मुझे बहुत खुशी हो रही है कि मैं प्रोफेसर देवेन पटेल जी को देख नहीं रहा हूं, लेकिन उनका नाम देख रहा हूं यहाँ पे। और मेरे हिसाब से वहां कुछ 6:15 हुए होंगे फिलाडेल्फिया में, जहां से वो जुड़ रहे हैं। मैं उनका बहुत आभारी हूँ कि इतने जल्दी, आई शुड स्विच टू इंग्लिश, दैट ही हैज cared to join us so early in the morning. Good morning and thank you, sir. You're very, very welcome to our conference on Beyond the Imperialism of Categories. And I think your chairperson is also here. I think I saw him. Srinivasan ji, are you there? Can you show yourself? If you can, I'll be grateful. We'd like to see your face because I would like to hand it over to you, Professor Srinivasan Krishnamurthy ji of the Vivekananda College. Namaskaram,
Yes,
sir. Vanakkam. You're most welcome from Chennai, from the great Vivekananda College, where I got admission, by the way, many, many years ago, when I wanted to do a pre-university in Chennai after Bangalore. But we leave that aside. I invite you to take over and chair this session. We have two very interesting papers. One by, as I said, Professor Devan on what is commentary on the Sanskrit Kavya. And the second paper is by Professor Frederick M. Smith from the University of Iowa, The Category of the Center, Bringing Together Forest and Village in Vedic Ritual. Over to you, Professor Srinivasan Krishnamurthy ji. Please take over. And one more line. I want to just say that This was supposed to be an open session, but it became a more or less closed session. But I assure you, after the papers, we'll have time. Please, everyone will have a chance to say whatever they want to say. My apologies, because the 5-minute was not possible to maintain. So my apologies for that, and the discussion will continue. Yes, Professor Srinivasan Krishnamurthy ji, over to you. I'm muting myself.
To make things easier for you, I am just Srinivasan. Krishnamurthy is father's name. We don't get addressed by surnames, only by our first name. So just Srinivasan. Okay, thank you. And I think Professor Devan Patel is here. Shall we start? If there is any chat box, then you have to manage it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please start. Please start. Go ahead. You can introduce Professor Patel if you don't mind, and if otherwise, Professor Patel can introduce himself.
So I will take the pleasure of introducing him. If any further information, he can add. Professor Devan Patel, you are welcome. And he is an associate professor at the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And he has authored the book Text to Tradition, the Naishadhiya Charita and Literary Community in South Asia, a Columbia publication of 2014. His research areas include classical Indian literature and aesthetics, with a focus on Sanskrit poetry and poetics, regional cultures of South Asia, Indian philosophy, myth, critical theory, and translations. These are some of the areas which he is concentrating and studying. And now, Professor Devan Patel. He will be speaking on what is a commentary on a kavya.
Thank you, Professor Srinivasan. I'm very honored to be here. Also, Professor Jain, who is not here, but I thank him for this invitation. I'm so happy to see all of some people that I've spoken with, especially Professor Paranjape. It's very nice to see you as well, and thank you for hosting all of this. I wish, just hearing Professor Shukla, I wish I could deliver this in Sanskrit or Hindi or Telugu or some other language, but my facility is very limited, so I will speak as best I can in English, and that too in American English. So I'm very curious to hear more about this university also, Flame. You know, it's a good name. It reminds me of the famous image of the Buddha, that an unwavering mind is like a flame in a windless place. So this is a good thing. So when I was looking at the theme of the conference, I just thought, you know, speaking of categories, that the commentary, this name that we give for, you know, a host of practices, you know, tika, vyakya, bhashya, all of these things. So I thought it's very useful to interrogate this or question or think about this category. So I didn't mean it simply as a rhetorical question, asking this, what is a commentary on Sanskrit kavya? You know, it was not meant to simply be a question that I would then give an answer to, but it's a real genuine search for answers, since the complex value that the tika offers a reader of kavya is almost completely, you know, untheorized by the Sanskrit scholars themselves, outside of as I'll explain, a few things that they discuss. And I'm not, of course, the only person. Thankfully, there's a lot of people studying this, and it's a global question that people are asking about trying to understand this tradition, because as you'll see, nearly you know, the majority of works that are in Sanskrit are in the form of a commentary. So it's really the big tradition, you see, on that front. So I will just, I'll share the screen. I wanted to share this project that they're doing in, it's two colleagues of in Europe, this Elisa Ganser and Daniele Gunei, are doing this very nice project on commentary that I'm very happy to be part of. Let me see if I can share this. this is just so you can read it, that literary commentaries are crucial for understanding the relation between theoretical prescriptions and compositional performative practices, as they often put these two dimensions of literature, the theoretical and the practical, into dialogue. Moreover, a host of knowledge systems, Natya Shastra, Alankara Shastra, Vyakarana, Mimamsa, etc., along with their philosophical insights, technical vocabulary, and hermeneutical technique, are employed, combined, and creatively refunctionalized in literary commentaries, which therefore represent a liminal genre of Shastra that crosses the seemingly well-established boundaries among disciplines and offers to the modern scholar a unique window into the intellectual life of pre-modern South Asia. So, of course, this is one of the areas which I'll speak a little bit about, the more kind of the interconnection of the Tika with all of these well-developed Shastras, especially Vyakarana and Mimamsa and Nyaya, but also, of course, Alankara Shastra. And, but also, the Tika, for most people who know it, I mean, anybody who studies, pre-modern India, especially, they know that what a Tika looks like, right? Always we have, whatever language it is, there's some, you have the Mula, and then you have Tika, and it could be in many different types of, in many different languages, sometimes on the printed page or in manuscript. And then, in English also, we've seen this reproduced these days. But the Tika also, we know, is simply often, as an idea of a category, sometimes it is, it suggests too much, and I think that some misperceptions arise because of this. So, we expect that from the word commentary, that you'll have some kind of in-depth analysis, elaborate explanations, coherent readings, and also some kind of appreciation for the verse or the poems or something of that sort. But there, some of these things are I think, mistakenly attributed to what the Tika is doing. Sometimes, as many people know, it's simply, and this I'll also go into, about it being a kind of representation or reflection of an oral teaching. So I was just yesterday, I thought I would bring this up. Yesterday I was reading, we have a reading group. There's some friends in India and in the US. We are reading right now the 11th Sarga of the Naishadi Charitam. And there was this wonderful example which I thought I would just bring. And this is, from, this is the section where they're at Damayanti Swayamvara. And of course, Vishnu is there, Shri Vishnu with lying on Adishesha. And Lakshmi is a little bit scared that if Vishnu sees Damayanti, that he may fall in love with her, you see. So the text reads, this line, Vadrupa sampad avalokana jata shanka. So you have this idea of shanka. So now a student might ask, what is the shanka? What is her, because the text will not explain what Lakshmi's shanka is. So we have the Tika. So the Tika sometimes just explains something like this, right? So Narayana, this is one of the Tikakaras, he says, Ayam Shri Vishnu imam che drakshyati, tarhi mam vihaya asyam anurakto bhavishyati. So if Shri Vishnu sees Damayanti, sees her, then he will leave me and he will fall in love with her. So now this is not as dramatic and as intellectually large as, thinking about all of these systems and their significance with all of these Shastras. But you see, the kavya, a tika can operate on so many levels, not only from a kind of a high level of giving us an insight into the intellectual life of the sort of very technical, textual life of you know, these literary communities of Sanskrit and other languages, but also we get a sense of the very everyday, mundane situation of teaching and pedagogy that is reflected here. So anyway, I'll explain some of this, but just wanted to propose that, because there's no real theory about this, what I am proposing is that I think that the lack of theoretical energy that's spent on what the tika on a kavya is supposed to do is, I think, willful, in that it suggests that the format is intended to be incomplete, provisional, and it's not meant to give you some kind of interpretation or reading or coherent even statement about what the poem is, but it's more than simply just a aid or a resource. So it's somewhere in between, I think, that very skillfully facilitates a kind of mental reconstruction or a translation for the so that one can then produce and maybe, if one wishes, create a kind of coherent reading afterwards. So what I've written here is that it is perhaps an artifactual remainder of oral teaching practices, as well as part of a complex and sophisticated reading attitude, and not, as it has often been understood, a transparently secondary form of textuality, useful to occasionally consult, but not necessarily to read together with the source. So I'll come back to this in our question and answer, but just to save time and to have everything packed in this short period, I thought I would just give an abstract of some summary points that maybe then I'll go into in a deeper way. So, so the first thing is that the tika is really quintessentially an Indian form of textuality, in the sense that it's often a very helpful way to think about, articulate, and create sense and meaning. And from an educational and pedagogical perspective, the tika, as we see in the manuscripts or on the printed page, represents an artifact of a special kind of pedagogy between students and teachers and students, and also a special kind of scholastic communique between teachers and other teachers. In this way, the oral pedagogy we see formalized in the tika also brings us into the present day, where something like this method is still being used among teachers and students of kavya. Second point is that this is such an ubiquitous, such a widespread form, and yet there's been very little reflection, formal reflection, in Sanskrit tradition about it. Of course, there's been a lot of very good work, at least in English, that I've seen in the last so many years. It's a very good from one of my teachers, Gary Tubb, and his colleague Emery Bose has written a very good book on scholastic Sanskrit. It's a sort of a manual that helps to read some of these from for students who are just learning and or to have a kind of overall perspective. Also, some very good work coming out by other scholars. I recently read this very nice work on the commentaries of Mahakavya by Andrei Klebanov. It sort of looks at it from a structural point of view. So there are many things, but I read in a recent book on world philology. This is Professor, he's been mentioned, Professor Pollock, Sheldon Pollock. He's written that 75% of Sanskrit textuality is in the form of a commentary. So this just gives you a sense of how significant this form is, and also not just from the perspective of it representing a reading method, but also a kind of reflection of an intimate pedagogy, and also a shared practice that binds and connects generations of readers, including up to today. So that's another point that maybe it's worth emphasizing and dwelling on just briefly afterwards. Then there is this, what's useful is to look at to the commentary on Kavya, Stika, side by side with commentary on what we might think of as Shastra, Darshana, or even something like what we might call a scriptural commentary, right? So commentary on Veda or Buddha Vachana or the Jain Sutra, right? These are all different types of, and we have so many names and this complex typology around all of these, and sometimes they're used interchangeably and sometimes they're given very technical specific meaning. So everybody knows who has read these works, Tika, Vyakya, Bhashya, Vartika, Gudhartha, Panjika, Pariksha, Deepa, all these names, Avachurni, Churni. So there's so many different kinds of subgenres of this. The other part is that the Kavya commentaries, and they sort of came up at the same time when we have the rise of manuscripts. So in writing and printing. We think for the last 1,000 years, at least, these commentaries have been the most important form up until the modern period. And some of these became, why there's so many written is that they were probably had a certain role in the material culture of institutions, but also, as I speak about with the Naishadesha tradition, and I'll explain a little bit more here, is that writing a Vyakya or a Tika also was part of demonstrating one's, accomplishment in the field or something like this. So they had some credential granting status. And the other thing, of course, is, and this is what connects up the Sanskrit Tika on Kavya with all of the regional languages of India, right? We have this is one article I've written that I'm interested in the subject of thinking about how the Sanskrit source and the Tika on that is connected with all of the great poets in regional languages who wanted to translate, not necessarily the way we think of translation, but wanted to bring some of the Sanskrit source into their languages. And here we have these early, great poets such as, Bhalan, Bhalana in Gujarat, or Srinatha in Andhra and other places and everywhere who themselves were surely Sanskrit scholars as well. And the way in which they take over the function of the Tika in their own works, and they're aware of Tika itself, you see. So there's a certain kind of intersection of all of these different types of approach and attitudes towards the source. And this is how culture forms. And it's a very useful, I think, model to think about, one of these sort of a micro study of how to think about how there's a kind of translation or movement from one culture to another. So these are just some of the basic points, and I thought I would go into each one of them just briefly, and then hopefully have some good conversation with everybody. The first one was about this being a very important from the point of view of pedagogy, and from the point of view of its being very closely connected with very distinctively Indian forms of reading. And this, I think one can think of the commentary being as a kind of artifact, in that in some ways captures the physical conditions of, for example, the Pathashala or some kind of setting where the Tika recreates that context. So, even today, one can experience this where, you will have one particular, as you're going down the different verses of a poem, the teacher may recite it first. And, if the student picks it up immediately, Shruti Matra, then they will move on. But obviously these poems be very difficult sometimes or not immediately available. So the teacher will explain. First he'll give Anvaya or some kind of breaking it down, and you have this is from the Parashara Purana, which is in the Nyaya Kosha. We see this kind of so-called definition of what a tika or a commentary should do. There's a couple of versions of this, so I've just given both here. But basically, this word tika, right? What it might mean is it's just some kind of moves, right? Tik. So tikyate gamyate granthartho anaya. So there's some sense that there's what is happening, what's going on. So some of the most common things that this tika is supposed to do is explain. So it divides the words, it puts everything in some kind of anvaya. It gives it delimits the range of meaning, right? Perhaps that it can have. So the teacher will go through this process, of course, and if after going through it once, he recites the verse again, and perhaps there is still no understanding, so the process will continue until there's something where you can just hear the verse and you can move on from it. So that's just one kind of thing which that the tika sort of performs, and once it's done, then the idea of it being an interpretation is not necessarily there's not any question of that. So the second point that I was making was that that this is a form which is really not highly theorized, except for something like this, where you have these this kind of definition of basically what it's just describing what it's doing. People have not really given the tika kind of metacritical reflection, at least not in a formal way in Sanskrit works, not that I'm aware of at least. And so many kinds of misperceptions have arisen about some of these works. And I think it's useful to go through some of these misperceptions and maybe also, think about what at the end why I think that this is maybe we should think about the tika in a different way. But one of the misperceptions is that the kavya tika is a critical explanation or an interpretation, and I don't see it itself as a kind of translation. I don't see this as actually holding. In fact, I see that the tika itself is not exactly a translation or an interpretation, and nor is it really an appreciation of the kavya either, as it's sometimes said to be. But it's really, it facilitates all three. It makes possible the ability for you to translate, for you to appreciate, and for you to interpret, if you want to call it that, right? The other misperception is that the Kavya Tika simplifies the text or justifies and again appreciates the words of the poet. And again, unlike outside of something like this verse here from the Nyaya Kosha or from the mysterious Parashara Purana, there's really nothing which kind of substantiates that claim either. Then there is the misperception that the Kavya Tika can just basically be viewed as a kind of epiphenomena of Vyakarana, Mimamsa, Nyaya, and that the commentaries on, that is to say, the commentaries on grammar and the interpretation or exegesis of Vedic ritual, right, to identify the injunction or the prohibition, or it's often just thought to be similar to, say, bhashya that you see on Vedanta or any of the other darshana shastras, where you just have that the kavya is just like that. It's just another type of commentary, or that it's simply sort of practice-focused handmaidens of Alankara Shastra. But these also, I think, are gross misperceptions on some level, because while they certainly draw on these earlier models of commentary writing, and they are certainly interdisciplinary in their use of the methods, especially Mimamsa and Nyaya, right? The ways in which the Anvaya is constructed, and the priority or hierarchy they give in giving the different meanings if there are multiple meanings. Still, I think that, and while of course the Kavya Tika is very closely tied to Alankara Shastra as well, poetics, it does not necessarily carry the commitments of those disciplines. In other words, the literary commentary does not focus on interpretation as such, like the Mimamsa, or the commentaries on Buddha Vachana, right? Or the commentators on the Jain Sutra. And nor is it solely focused on identifying and evaluating correct linguistic usage and giving assessments, appreciating or diminishing the quality of the value of any given work. So it also, I think, doesn't always function as simply as a practical tool of Alankara Shastra. Another misperception is that these commentaries they exist in some kind of, ahistorical space and are generally static or uniform or faceless, interchangeable. So the names of the commentators can change and the different things, but we just see them as just part of this, they're doing the same thing. So we, just have this very dismissive attitude about their individuality of these, each of these tika. And of course, in modern languages, tika also comes to mean like just some kind of critical comment only, right? That somebody gives a tika to something. But the fact, I think, is that while they do look similar to each other, each of the commentaries were composed, used, and shared in special contexts between teachers and students, teachers and other teachers, and sometimes between scholars and patrons. And each one carries with it its own special approach that often borrows or is intertextually related with other commentaries of the same work. So, and we have interesting anecdotal evidence that writing a commentary on certain works conferred some kind of credential. So, when I was looking at the Naishadhiya Charitam, the tradition of that work, it was very interesting that I found that that sometimes that one of the anecdotes of the tradition is that that if you write a commentary on one of three works, then you are deemed to be a Mahamahopadhyaya, right? This idea of either a commentary on Kavya Prakasha, the great Alankara Shastra Mammata, a commentary on Nyaya Kusumanjali, which is Udayanacharya, and a commentary on the Naishadhiya Charitam of Sri Harsha. So, and of course, it is no coincidence that all three of these works are very heavily commented. So many commentaries on all three of these works. And so, I think there is some practical sense about these commentaries, and they existed in different times. So we can study the different types of commentaries as doing different functions at different times. And that's another interesting way of approaching all of this. But, it's not good. I don't wish to be so, materially deterministic that that these works cannot be also seen as really generating a certain kind of complex reading that helps also to, self-understand the work. Okay, so see, these are some of the misperceptions and some of the sort of counters that I propose, but also there's so many complaints about the tika, and these complaints are not only from the modern period and from Indologists and of the earlier generation, but also from traditional Sanskrit teachers and commentators as well. So And this may lie in this, we are talking about the imperialism of categories. This might lie in the very category that we, or this, commentary or anything that we might think is that it's misleading because it suggests too many things. As I said, description, explanation, interpretation, contextualization, argument, counter-argument, and some kind of coherence. And yet, what happens is that when these expectations are not met, of course, we will have many complaints that they are not doing what we want them to do. That this tika is not performing the way we would like it to perform. And so some are very specific complaints, that they are too fragmentary, or they are just repeating the original, or that there's no objective or critical information. Another complaint is that it's that they elaborate on unwanted information, and they neglect important information. This is a famous passage from the Raja Martanda Tika of Bhoja on the Yoga Sutra. And here he is complaining about the Tikakaras, right? He's saying that he says that, Durbodham Yadativa, I can't read this myself here, Tad Vijahati. So whatever is difficult, they say it is Spashtartham, and it is clear. And then when there are clear meanings, Spashtartheshu, they go on and on. Ati Vistritim Vidadati, right? And they prattle on uselessly. Yarthaihi samasadi kaihi, about compounds, and they do analysis. So it says that the tika seems to confuse issues for readers by going bahubir jalpair brahmam tanvate. And so this is one of the sort of ancient complaints, if you will, on the tika, but many complaints there have been. And, I don't want to say that the tika is only doing, sometimes does not give coherent readings or interpretations. It's not true. Of course, there are some very special commentaries that often stand out. We think about the Bhavartha Deepa of Nilakanta Chaturdhara, on the Mahabharata. Very interesting commentary and very different from others. Or Purna Saraswati's commentary on the Malati Madhava, for instance, which is makes it into kind of an allegory of sorts. And such commentaries exist on the Amaru Shataka and the Abhignana Shakuntalam. So such things are there, but but they also are participating still in this kind of larger world of just helping to piece together things. So the other point was that sometimes it's useful to think, it's useful for us to maybe think about the commentary on Kavya alongside the commentaries on scripture or philosophy. And here we have to kind of maybe draw the distinction between them. And the Kavya commentary, of course, follows the procedures which were developed in other contexts, such as Vyakarana, especially Mimamsa and Nyaya. But what distinguishes the Kavya commentary from the more interpretation-heavy commentary on these on Veda or Buddha Vachana or the Jain Sutra is that the end result of the Kavya commentary is not meant to yield an explicit interpretation. Rather, it is meant to set the limits for an interpretation by deriving all of the probable meanings that the source intends based on the parameters set by grammar, poetic conventions, the context of the work as a whole, and an expanded common sense that sometimes also allows for unusual, but nevertheless possible readings. And when multiple options exist, or more refined secondary senses exist, these meanings are usually ordered with the commentator's sense of the common or intended usage first, followed by the more exceptional explanations. very rarely Kavya commentators might prioritize an exceptional sense before giving the common sense. Clearly, however, rather than the goal being an interpretation, the Kavya commentaries sought only to do the necessary to facilitate a reading and perhaps an interpretation, to open the text up, and not to narrow its scope. So the goal of most of the Kavya commentaries I'm saying here seems to be to extract the maximal amount of optimal information about the verse's linguistic elements so that they can then be reconstituted mentally to create a meaning that in different measures triggers and elevates a cognitive, emotional, or imaginative understanding in the individual reader. So just to, sometimes also the tikakaras give some idea of what they're trying to do themselves, right? These are some famous, a few aspects here that, that gives you a sense that there's a real communication happening between a sender and a receiver, and they're not just being written almost invisibly and transparently. They're part of a system, part of a culture, a community. And, they're all trying to do different things. So sometimes there's, explains that they're just doing it for themselves, or they're for a student, or for the Sahridaya. Then sometimes they have arguments with other commentators saying that, Mallinath has, of course, the very famous one, where he's saying that I'm just sticking with the source. Other people try to give too much, or they don't really do a good job, etc. Nevertheless, so I'll just finish here by just giving some, since we don't have any traditional idea, sort of hypothesis about what the Tika on Kavya might be doing, I thought, this is our job. So as scholars, to give some kind of hypothesis, even if we're not sure about its value or if we can substantiate it right now, but it's good to have a conversation about it. And so my idea is that the Tika is purposefully, willfully made incomplete, in the sense that, and I'll read here. So the resultant incompleteness of the Tika as a literary artifact, therefore, while it disturbs the source out of its slumber, this is one of the words that there's some very good articles on the different methods that the Jain commentators, Sangadasa and others, there's two very good articles, one by Mari Yashasyaravia, so if I mispronounced her name, and Paul Dundas, about these techniques like Anuyoga and Nikshepa, right? Ways in which the Jain Tikakaras were using, were approaching the work, and to bring it out of the meaning out of its slumber. The meaning is sleeping inside the verse, and it's the job of the reader using techniques to awaken it, to bring it about, and then to put it into some kind of system. So I'm saying that while the Tika does disturb that source, and maybe this is the idea of Tika itself, it's moving, it's shaking the source a little bit so that meanings fall out. It itself remains sketchy and elusive. And this, I think, need not indicate its inadequacy, nor necessarily even some kind of humility, that it's just giving many, many meanings from all perspectives. Rather, I think the in-process semblance of an appreciation, interpretation, or translation that it offers might intimate a creative potency that engenders an escape from the tempting leash of fixed reading agendas. So on some level, it's attempting to generate meaning, to have that fine balance of not telling you what it means and not even discussing it in the form itself, but to allow for the reader to have all the tools to be able to put together some kind of meaning. And I think that the inability to easily use these documents to reconstruct some kind of historicist, culturalist, or even literary critical purpose, and just rest in its unfinishedness. I think this may account for much of the annoyance and complaints that have been often put upon the commentary, because people expect some coherent interpretation, some coherent explanation. But this is not what the pedagogical attitude of this tradition is, right? It's not to tell you what to think and how exactly, for the Kavya at least. And also it is merely to open up the latitude for the reader to interpret. And then the reader may, of course, put together a translation or an interpretation, or even some kind of nibandha, some kind of essay about it. But it's not the job of the tikakar to do that for you. So the reading then becomes as much creative as it is analytical. Most literary tika and the oral pedagogy it represents seem to relate to their source in that same way, inviting the reader to engage in a direct relationship with the source so as to enter its semantic and affective world with as little mediation as possible. So a provisional approach might be to take the tika form as a complete genre, whose internal logic is to remain preliminary and perform a consciously unfinished act of translation, which is, of course, simultaneously also an act of interpretation in a continuum that may further on lead to a reconfigured act of translation. So then you can also repurpose the Sanskrit source into another Sanskrit paraphrase, or adapt it or transcreate it into another language. And the provision of synonyms and syntactic structures then can also be directly transplanted into or implanted into another language, along with the discovered sense. If we look at Nilakanta's work, it's a wonderful. Professor Chris Minkowski has traced the corpus of Nilakanta, who not only did the tika on Mahabharata, but then also wrote what we might think of as essays on the Mahabharata, right? This kind of mantra rahasya interpretations. But the tika, of course, served as this very good kind of nucleus, a kernel from which to build other readings. And so the final thing is that ultimately the intention and pedagogical strategy of the tika seems to empower the reader, while retaining ambiguities and ambivalences within the source, and also subtly engaging, or suggesting rather, a strategy to read them. The tika strengthens an individual's understanding by instigating further investigation, in withholding statements of interpretation or appreciation and rather providing glosses. It furthers pedagogical objectives to hone skills and not merely confer instruction. While many may find it unfounded and thus justifiably read against it, the initial faith one puts in the commentator's implicit translation of the source structures the reader's capacity to receive and assess the reading it prompts. So, the tikakar is a trusted teacher who is helping you, and that faith that you put into that helps also to create further readings. And the success of the tika then may not lie in the coherence or completeness it delivers, nor even whether it satisfies the reader's initial expectations, but rather in its ability to lead the reader to reconfigure the source's language in a manner that may even exceed or the presumed interests of the commentator or the author. So that's where I would like to end. Just, of course, this is a very famous line, that we see that the commentator knows, but not the poet. Vyakhyata janati natu kavi. And this, of course, we can go all the way back to the Upanishads, and the Brihadaranyaka and the Aitareya, where, there's a very famous line that the Devas love mysterious, cryptic things, right? And so, things should not be all thoroughly explained so easily, and that's part of the pedagogical strategy, to always lead people to their own thoughts rather than to always be very explicit. So I'll stop here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. There is a famous statement, Tika tukam apekshate. That is generally made in a pejorative way. That is,
And
if a commentary
sometimes the mula, they say mula magava tika without a tika. That the tika is sometimes more difficult than the mula itself.
Yes, that's why Tika tukam apekshate. Tuka, even though tuka is a derisive word, so I should not offer a tuka on Mr. Patel's paper, which is self-explanatory, who has taken Tika as a genre. So now better, but I am not able to avoid quoting Apai Dikshita. Apai Dikshita has written a commentary on Yadava Bhidaya on the 8th or 9th verse of the first canto. After writing elaborate commentary on the first few verses, Apai Dikshita says, Itham vichintya sarvatra bhavas santi pade pade kavitarkika simhasya kavyeshu laliteshvapi. If you go on think, you can go on expound different types of meanings, etc., and rasa and so many things, all these things for the readers, for them to know it. I just gave an idea in these verses, and now I will just give only indications, the lines, how we can go. And it is up to the individual to proceed in his own way. Everybody should be a commentator for himself, or a reader, or an appreciator. This is what Apai Dikshita has said. So the Tika is not giving the all, but anyway. Now, thank you, sir, for what is called the taking through what is called the maze of literature of Tika. Okay, now let me invite Professor Frederick. I think he's here.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, thank you. Welcome. Professor Frederick Smith. He is a professor of Sanskrit and classical Indian religions in the Department of Religious Studies and the Asian and Slavic Languages and Literature. And he has a doctorate from Pennsylvania, and his works include studies of text and the performance of Vedic sacrificial ritual, especially which has seen a great revival in India recently from nearly Tamil Nadu to Rajasthan. There are almost in every state, there are so many Agnihotris, and from antiquity to the present day, and study of religious experience in India with a focus on the history and phenomenology of the deity and spirit possession. He has specializing on and interested in Vallabhacharya, his Pushtimarga, and his successors, as well as Mahabharata. A great study, a great work, and thank you, Professor Frederick. Now the field is yours.
Yes, thank you. At one point, I'm going to want to put a PowerPoint of a few photos on my screen, but I suppose I can just do that, and you'll see it as it is. But first, let me say that the topic which I gave to Professor Pankaj for the conference is pretty much what I'm going to talk about here. The idea being of indigenous categories. And what I had thought is that I would look at kind of the cultural extensions of the term avapa. And avapa is a term from the Vedic Shrauta Yajnas, in which the avapa is the central offering, and everything else is on both sides. There's all the introductory rites, all the concluding rites, and in the very center, you have the avapa, whatever it might be, whether it's in an Ishti or Darsha Purnamasa, something like that, with the new and full moon ritual where you have the offering of rice flour, balls, and ghee, and so on in the avapa. That's what it constitutes. What I'm doing here is something pretty different from that, actually. I just wanted to bring that up because there's this center, and then there's the different peripheries around it. I've written something out that's, as sometimes happens with me, well, maybe more than sometimes, it just keeps going and going and going. and I can barely contain it in a center. And turned out when I wanted to write something for this conference, it's come out to something like 75 pages. And that's only like a rough previous draft, so God knows what's going to come of it in the long run. But I wanted to talk here about certain things that have had to do with my previous research. And then when I saw one of my favorite all-time people and mentors in India, Dr. D.R. Purohit, on screen, I thought, oh my God, this is such a privilege, as it always is, to be in his presence, even if it's cyber presence. I thought, well, I'm going to change around a little bit what I'm going to present here because Purohitji is sitting right here in the room that I recognize well. And so I will adapt a bit of what I was going to say here. What the categories, indigenous categories, as you might say, are the categories of grama and aranya, of village and forest. A famous article was written in French, published around 1976 by a Sanskrit scholar, a very, very smart and wonderful one named Charles Malamud, and who spoke largely about grama and aranya in Vedic India. And contrasting the cultivated, civilized, complex, and humane grama with the aranya, which was disorderly, uncultivated, wild, unadorned, fearsome, all of these different things. But what was it that really determined the grama and aranya, and was there any space in between them? Was there this kind of avapa? Was there this center space between the forest and the village? Well, yes, there was. And you can say this both physically and analogically if you look at the way that things work inside the human mind. Is there this disorder and order, or is there, because if we deeply examine ourselves, and I tell my students to do this in classes sometimes, I say, just sit and be quiet and think of nothing for like 2 minutes. Just try it as a yoga exercise. And then I'll ask them, well, how many thoughts have you had in the last 2 minutes? 10, 20, 100, 1,000, a million? When we really look deep within ourselves, we'll find utter chaos. But we present ourselves in a certain way. And the same thing is that there's stuff that we're afraid of, which is the dark, the forces of the night, the Bhut and Pret and all of these things. And then there's the way we present ourselves, the way we build our cities, the way we cultivate, the way we write, the way we try to get tika and vritti out of text, the way that one of my real favorites, Devin Patel, has just described. I'm really happy to be on a panel with Devin, even if it's on Zoom. So let me just say that let me give a couple of examples. I've this long thing that I've written in draft. It's like I just move my screen a little bit. Rising sun behind me. That there's 4 areas in which I've addressed in this longer paper. I'm not going to address them all here, but I'll address a couple of them. The settlement and the wilderness. There's a few instances that I've discussed that I'm going to just briefly mention here from the Mahabharata, a text which I've been working on for a long time as the final 5 Padmans for the Chicago series. Was started by von Buitenen in 1970, but is now migrating from Chicago to a publisher in Delhi, Primus Books, under the wonderful Mr. Bholanath Verma, and has taken up this project from Chicago. As Malamud states here about the Grama and the Aranya, that the two zones of forest and village are generally distinguished from one another, less on the basis of their material features than on that of the religious and social significance attributed to each of them. Many people have used Malamud's articles, maybe you can say especially Patrick Olivelle, in his study of the ashrama system in India, and of the Grihasthashrama, the Vanaprastha, the Sannyasashrama, and what does it mean to be in the Vanaprastha? What does the Vanaprastha mean? So I'm going to take an example or two of this from the Mahabharata. And the case studies I present in my longer paper, which Bhagavad Gita Kripa will see the light of day at some point soon, is an idealized description of the sacrificial arena used for in the Mahabharata in Yudhishthira's Ashwamedha, in which there's the construction of a temporary liminal space that brings together elements from the domesticated and non-domesticated terrain. The second, which is one that I'll be looking at also a little bit here right now, is the meeting of Yudhishthira and his half-brother Vidura from the Ashramavasika Parvan of the Mahabharata, in which Vidura dies in the forest, and this discloses an unusual behavior that internalizes dharma, agency, ethical practice, brings together the spirits or the forces of the vana and the aranya, and how it provides an individual platform for bringing together the two. Another one that I'll mention very briefly, and here is Sri Mahapadhyaya Purohitji, right in my midst, so I need to do it well, is drawn from a performance of a Pandav Leela in a Himalayan village in 2013. And I'm indebted to my colleague at the University of Iowa, Professor Derek Clubb in the Department of Theater, for being with Purohitji and having the wits to photograph this scene, although he had no idea what he was photographing. But when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, look at this. So I've interpreted this, and what I'm not going to discuss is some of my field work at some of these psychological healing centers, again, which bring together the wilderness of the deep recesses of the mind and personality with the self-presentation and identity. In other words, in places like Balaji in Rajasthan and Jyotirnikara in Kerala, where the forces of order and disorder, Grama and Aranya, appear in direct conflict. But I won't have time to get into any of that today. Let me just move right into some of the subject matter without getting into the preliminaries of discussing the psychological phenomena that lead to it. But let's get to the paper here. So let's say that after the destructive war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas was settled in favor of the Pandavas, it became the duty of the Pandava ruler Yudhishthira to perform a horse sacrifice to solidify and demonstrate his sovereignty. This is described, I mean, we have the whole chapter, the whole Parvan, the Ashwamedhika Parvan, but the Ashwamedha occupies a very, very brief space in that, largely in my view, because the authors of the Mahabharata decided that, well, you know, if they want to know about the Ashwamedha, they can look at these ritual texts, which we already have. So why should I include all these cumbersome ritual details here? But you know, the whole sense of alapa here, because you have these enormous preliminaries for the Ashwamedha, including the Digvijaya, in this case, the Digvijaya of Arjuna going around India with 400 strong Kshatriyas to defend the horse from being stolen or messed with by any of the neighboring kingdoms. And the kingdoms in this case happen to be all of India, which is described, which I believe may be the first description of a Digvijaya in Indian literature. But one of the most colorful chapters in the Ashwamedha Parvan are two that depict the bountiful arrangements for this sacrifice. These chapters describe an entire city constructed at the site of the Ashwamedha to house the participants, the support staff, the invited guests, including princes from far-flung lands and hundreds of thousands of highly educated Brahmins. Even if this settlement, imagined as a semi-rural, bucolic venue, was intended to be short-lived, as it always is for rituals and sacrifices, because the venues are always abandoned afterwards. The opulence described here, which draws on the Aranya, is unbounded. So here's what this is: the 87th chapter, the first 16 verses of the Ashwamedha Parvan, the 14th book. At the commencements of the sacrifice, many eloquent disputants articulated their logic, wishing to defeat each other. O joy of the Kurus, the kings observed that this sacrifice, organized by Bhima, adhering to the highest standards, as if it were for the king of the gods himself. They saw its golden archways, its many couches, seats, and luxury ornaments, replete with gems. These princes witnessed water and storage pots, eating vessels, saucepans with handles, lids, and covers, none of them not forged from gold. They saw sacrificial posts, or yupas, carved from wood and ornamented with gold, as described in the learned texts. These wonderfully beautiful posts were arranged in the prescribed way and at the proper time. Lord, these kings saw many animals born on land and in water, all brought together there. They saw cows and buffaloes, including females, and those put out to pasture, aquatic animals, predatory animals, birds, those born from embryos, egg-born creatures, andaja, sweat-born, shwedaja creatures, and those produced from digging the earth, and animals from the mountains, shores, and forests. Seeing the entire sacrificial area decked out gaily with animals, herds of cattle, and grain, the princes entered into a state of complete amazement. A rich setting of fine, delicate food was prepared for the Brahmins and commoners alike. After 100,000 Brahmins had completed their meals, drums were beaten repeatedly like thunder in the clouds. This thundering was a constant feature day after day. In this way, the sacrifice of the wise Dharmaraja proceeded. The people saw gifts of food comparable to mountains, O kings, rivulets of yogurt and lakes of melted ghee. O king, at the great sacrifice of that king, the entirety of Jambudvipa, including its many townships, was seen gathered in one place. People from thousands of community backgrounds came, bringing wealth, O bull of the Bharatas. Kings, decked out in garlands and bright, well-polished earrings, served the foremost of the twice-born by the hundreds and thousands. The men who were their attendants also gave these Brahmins a variety of food and drink that was worthy of being consumed by these kings. So there you have only 16 verses. So this idealized and detailed opulence, brings together the animals from the forest. And note, my point here is of this liminal space, this liminal time. We have a city that's constructed that is only supposed to last the duration of this Ashwamedha, of this yajna, and then it's finished, then it's destroyed. So this is kind of the buffer zone in this example here, of between the grama and the aranya. This is kind of the avapa, the place where the central part of the whole psychological effort is contained in the construction of this place, the bringing together of elements from the forest and turning it into a city. We can see this throughout the whole history of Vedic sacrificial ritual. Even in the construction of the pots that are used from 7 different kinds of soil, like soil from a bottom of a lake that never goes dry, a place that a horse has stepped on, that a boar has kicked up from the earth, certain kinds of naturally perforated stones. All of these elements of nature from the kind of uncultivated rural landscape are brought in to bring together this sacrifice. But let me move on to my second example here, which is the death of Vidura in the Mahabharata. This is again, as I mentioned, in the ashrama Vasika Padvan. So we have the whole notion of ashrama here. And so what's happened is after the Ashwamedha is performed, and Yudhishthira has obtained his sovereignty, then it is time for the Dhritarashtra and Gandhari to go on their vanaprastha, to move into the forest. And thus it happens that they didn't go by themselves, but Vidura actually had preceded them. And Vidura, if anybody does not recall, Vidura is probably the wisest of the wise in the Mahabharata, right up there with Bhishma. But Vidura was from a different kind of, I mean, both the birth of both Vidura and Bhishma was complex, which I don't need to go into here. This story, perhaps more than anything else, of the death of Vidura, demonstrates that the boundary between Grama and Aranya was problematic and porous, just like the whole personality of the human, which we'll talk about in the third example from the penetrability and the ambiguity found throughout the Mahabharata, from the burning of the Lakshagruha, the house of lac, to the disrobing of Draupadi and the aftermath and the exile of the Pandavas to the forest, the war itself, the Bhagavad Gita itself, and right there in this liminal space between the two armies. And finally, even the trek up to Swargarohana at the end of the Mahabharata. But there's a few better tales about the liminal spaces, about the relationship between Grama and Aranya, than in the tale of the death of Vidura. As I mentioned, Vidura was the wisest of the wise, Dharma incarnate. He was the half-brother of Yudhishthira. So they both shared paternity, their father being Dharma. But through the unusual machinations of or the usual machinations, I should say, of Mahabharata ambiguity, he was born the son of the great sage Vyasa, who impregnated the low-caste, if still celestial servant girl. And as a result, Dharma itself became ambiguous, mixed, and inconsistent. Ironically, the spirit of this Varna Sankara, or mixing of castes, as the Bhagavad Gita puts it in 142, turned out to be unalloyed in his dharma and wisdom, namely Yudhishthira. Certainly his comportment of dharma was more straightforward than that of his curiously naive and flawed half-brother Yudhishthira, the king of the Pandavas, born of the union of Vyasa through Pandu and Kunti, the head of the family that eventually won the devastating war against their cousins, the Kauravas, the father, namely Pandu. So Yudhishthira, known for his righteousness and thoughtfulness, as well as for his haplessness and his ruinous error of judgment that led to the war, was regarded as the twin of Vidura and was regularly called Dharmaraja. But let me just cut to the quick here, that after the war was over and the horse sacrifice was performed, we saw yet more ambiguity as the Ashwamedha, the Ashwamedhika Padvan ends with this incredible bit of ambiguity with the episode of the Golden Mongoose, where we have the family of this Brahmin family lived out in this liminal area, in this field, just living off of grains that were dropped, that were not collected. And in the end, that was declared by the golden mongoose to be a superior form of dharma than the actual Vedic sacrifice itself. Anyway, without going into the whole nature of Mahabharata ambiguity, which is probably clear to everybody who's in this audience, um, the clans got together. Yudhishthira accompanied Dhritarashtra and Gandhari out to their new forest hut where they were going to ponder themselves for a long time, do a lot of meditation as they're in their vanaprastya. We have this going on here. Once they arrived, Yudhishthira asked Dhritarashtra about Vidura. Where's Vidura? Has anybody seen Vidura? And so here's this chapter from 12 verses from chapter 33 of the Ashramavasika Pavan. Even as Dhritarashtra was asking about Vidura, the former chamberlain, namely Vidura, was sighted far off, naked and thin, hair matted, his mouth filled with stones, his body smeared with dirt and covered with dust from the forest. He looked towards the hermitage, saw all people gathered there, and swiftly turned away. When King Yudhishthira was informed of this, he ran all alone in pursuit of him, following Vidura as he plunged deeper into the dreadful forest, sometimes in view, sometimes not. And as he ran after him with all his might, the king cried out, Vidura, Vidura, I am your much beloved king Yudhishthira. Then Vidura, foremost of the wise, halted in a solitary spot in the depths of the forest and leaned against a tree. King Yudhishthira of mighty wisdom recognized Vidura of mighty wisdom from his look, that he was almost completely wasted away. Standing before him, the king said, I am Yudhishthira, in his hearing. In answer, the wise Vidura gestured with his hand. Then, gazing unblinking at the king and in deep meditation, he entered into him, fusing his own sight with his sight, his own limbs with his limbs, his own breath with his breath, his own senses with his senses. Thus Vidura, seeming to blaze with fiery energy, used his yogic power to enter the body of King Yudhishthira, Lord of Dharma. As for his own body, it remained as it was, leaning with staring eyes against the tree. The king saw that it was now lifeless. He also sensed that he himself was now many times more powerful than before. Pandu's learned son of mighty ardor, the Lord of Dharma, recalled his own former history, the Lord of peoples and the way of yoga, as Vyasa has described. I should say that even though I've also done a translation of this, I've decided to use this translation by John Smith of Cambridge University in his long edited version of the Mahabharata published in 2009. I just like the way that John Smith writes, so I decided, well, I'll just put his in. So this story has many elements, not just of possession as it occurs in the Mahabharata, but can extend other layers of Indian history and doctrine. But this story presents an uneasy transition or even a rupture between settlement and forest, between the comparative safety of domestic life in the world and the comparatively dangerous life of the renunciant in the forest. In the end, they merge, in part because the forest renunciant, the emblematic of the aranya, is absorbed into the body of the recognizable domesticated paragon of the grama, namely Yudhishthira. It is the manifest destiny of the grama to press into and absorb the aranya. A city is always spreading out and taking over forest land. The dissociation that characterizes both Vidura's final state and the division of Dharma into half-brothers is healed, made complete again, by the king's ability to absorb Vidura's spirit. Yudhishthira is possessed by the wild forest renunciant Vidura, who embraces his dark side, his mixed caste birth, with unflinching rectitude and resolve. This also goes back to J.C. Hestermann's notion of the conundrum of the king's authority. This enables the king to recuperate the strength that has left him. Even if Yudhishthira and Vidura are equally descended from Dharma, the fulfillment of Yudhishthira's authority over both Grama and Aranya emerges only when the untamed intercaste outsider is fully absorbed into the body of the king. Both are Dharma incarnate, representing the perfection of habitation and wilderness. Vidura overcomes the dangers of the forest, while Yudhishthira overcomes the equally immense challenges of life in the world. So this is kind of a liminal space. It happens as Yudhishthira dies. It happens in this Vanaprastya location. Again, it's a strong example of what happens when the forces of the forest and the forces of the drama come together. What I'm going to do now is go into my third and final example I'm going to talk about here, which is something that happened in the presence of Sri Purohitji and my colleague in the theater department at the University of Iowa, who was right on top of his camera, and as I say, he had no idea what he was photographing. But in this was in the context of a Pandav Leela in the village of Raital, in about maybe 30 kilometers or so up the Ganga, up the Bhagirathi, from where, in fact, I have a house about 12 kilometers up from Uttarkashi, and where I would be right now if it weren't for this other weird thing going on, this pandemic. Certainly at this point, I would be there, May. So let me, I wonder whether I can, I'm going to try to share my screen, or at least go to my PowerPoint, and whether it'll be visible to you is something that remains to be seen, but let's just see if I can do this. Wait a minute, where did that go? Here it is. I, like so many people in the world, what are you seeing? Are you seeing the PowerPoint, or are you seeing me? You're seeing me, aren't you? Okay. I've got to ask somebody there. How can I?
Should be French, there should be a share button in the bottom.
Oh, because I'm used to Zoom, but I don't know how it works with this.
Yeah, it is new to me also, but there's a share button. It's very similar to Zoom. There's a share button at the bottom.
A share button. Wait a minute. Let me go here. Wrong one. Okay, share button at the bottom. Oh, I see. Share. Okay.
Right. And then share
Open
window.
preferences.
Right, and then screen one. I think the first option should work.
It says open system preferences. That's first. Okay, let's just open it. And now it's on security, privacy, web events. Let me go to.
No, just share and then screen one. That's only 2 steps actually.
Sharing a screen, except it doesn't work. Mine. It says share and share only. Share, the only option it gives me is open system preferences. That's the only thing that it gives me. So I will then, to avoid further trouble, I will simply remain with myself and skip this PowerPoint. because I don't know how to export it in through share screen because my share, as I said, my share screen is absolutely not. It's dead.
Probably at the system preferences, you may have to click OK to allow it.
Open system preferences.
And click OK.
Wait a minute. Now this thing is just spinning around.
Oh, no.
Okay, now just click OK. Oh, wait a minute. Now it's
And then
okay.
you come back and it should allow you to share the screen.
Now, do I go to Cisco WebEx?
Yes, back to your WebEx screen, and then it should show
No,
you
I'm shared under shared.
Yes.
It goes to my immediately to security and privacy, and then to anyway. Anyway, but anyway, let's not waste any time. Let's just talk about this. So in this rite, which happened in the context of this pond of Lila in the Himalaya, um, the pond of Lila is not as well known as Ram Leelas or Krishna Leelas, of course, because it's really only performed in the Himalaya, and it hasn't become nationalized in the way that Ram Leela or Krishna Leela has. So almost nobody has seen it outside of the performers themselves, or a few intrepid scholars like William Sachs or Dr. Purohit or myself, just a few people outside the traditions themselves have ever actually seen these things. And but the Pond of Lila is again, it's the performance of certain aspects of the Mahabharata, as the name indicates, with Pandavas. And the main events, it ends up as a big shraddha. And in the end, which I was going to show here, but I will not, is the denouement of the entire Pond of Lila, which is the ritual destruction of a genda, a rhinoceros, as the supreme offering for any kind of a shraddha, which is actually mentioned in one verse in the Anushasana Parva in the 13th book of the Mahabharata without any elaboration, but it's simply mentioned there. But it was taken up, at least virtually, by the Pandav Lila tradition in the Himalayas. So what's happened here is that what I saw in these photos and what I'll describe was something so similar to what I saw, or to two passages in the Upanishads that I thought, how did this happen? So let me just go to Upanishad passages first, which is the transmission of inheritance from father to son. And this happens, let me get to the passages here, since I had hoped to diverge from that. But let's look at the passages themselves. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is the oldest of the Upanishads, dating maybe 6th or 7th century BCE at the earliest, maybe a little bit more recently, in 1.5.17, describes the following scene. Immediately before his expected death, man is instructed to transfer his essence to his son. You are the Brahman, you are the sacrifice, you are the world, he tells his son. I am the Brahman, I am the sacrifice, I am the world, replies his son. Thus he enters his son with his vital breaths. The same way we can say that Vidura entered Yudhishthira. He entered with his vital breaths. It is only through a son that a man finds a more secure footing in this world. Thereupon, these divine and immortal vital functions enter him. From the earth and fire, divine speech enters him. Divine speech is that which makes whatever one says happens. From the sky and the sun, the divine mind enters him. The divine mind is that which makes a person always happy or sorrowful. And the moon, the divine breath enters him. The divine breath is that which never falters, whether it's moving or at rest. And that's Patrick Olivell's translation. And the Kaushitiki gives rather more detail, says that the father lies down, dressed on a fresh garment, with a ritual fire kindled and a pot of water near at hand. The son lies down on the top of the father, touching his father's body parts with his own corresponding parts. Otherwise, they sit facing each other. Not only is the life breath transferred, but a similar formulaic rhythm of announcement and response, call and response. So are speech, sight, hearing, taste, actions, pleasures and pains, bliss, delight, procreative capacity, movement, mind, and intelligence. If the father is too unwell to speak very much, he may limit the transfer to the pranas alone. The son then turns around to his wife, to his right, walks toward the east, and his father wishes him well, saying, "May the glory, the luster of sacred knowledge and fame attend you." So the son then glances over his left shoulder, hiding his face with his hand or the hem of his garment, and replies, "May you gain the heavenly world and realize your desires." And Swangan Lokan Kaman Apnuhi. So thus the Kaushitaki Upanishad ends its account with a statement that if the father recovers his health, he should either live under the authority of his son or live as a wandering ascetic. But if he happens to die, they should perform the appropriate final rites for him. The point here is that that in this ritual of transferring one's physical, psychological essences, senses, breath, and so on to the body of his son by lying down on top of the son, this is how, this was one form of the way that inheritance was actually enacted in the Upanishads. And what we saw here in this pond of Lila, 2,500 years later, how did this happen? How could we even? I mean, there's nothing, so far as I know, in the entire history of Indian literature that shows any kind of a link between the Upanishads and what we saw in this village of Raital in 2013. And this was, let me just describe it, and that a man had been performing the role of Arjuna for 40 years. He was old, kind of wizened, kind of withered, and he was dressed in the ritual accoutrement for the Pond of Lila, which meant that not very much. And remember, these things are always performed in December because people come back. There's not much agricultural work to be done. People will come for vacation and so on, even though it's cold in the Himalayas at that time of year. And the people who are observing it, which is virtually the entire village and lots of other people, they're all very, very, warmly dressed in their parkas and so on. But the performers in the Pond of Lila, who are used to knowing how to get into these altered states of consciousness, into these states of possession. So the ritual person here who played the role of Arjuna, he became Arjuna. The character of Arjuna, the figure of Arjuna, the Mahabharata Arjuna possessed him during these rituals, during this ritual time. So this actor, this person who resident of the village, as a result of the regular possession and self-identification as Arjuna, came to occupy a part of his own identity, a very strong part. And here he was doing the same thing that we read about in the Upanishad. He was transferring this essence, this identity, to his son after himself doing this for 40 years. Um, um, and he has an unusually heavy janoi, and so let's just try to imagine this. In this village, we have this podium that's erected in this central space for the temple, for the main temple in the village. And it may be about 2 meters square and about 1 meter high. And it's just large enough for certain ritual dramatic actions to be performed. So the actor disrobed down to his chadi, which indicated that he felt the possession of Arjuna coming on. Then, with help, because he was old, he mounted the stage upon which 2 copper water vessels were placed. He quickly assumed the visage of possession, his eyes unblinking, and so on, and which he took up for the purpose, and then he took up for the purpose of divination a handful of rice or barley grains from a medium-sized bowl. This happens all the time in Himalaya as forms of divinations. You can see it 100 times in these Pandavlilas and in other rites in the Himalayas. There's thousands of forms of divination in India, but this one is commonly done in these rituals up there. So and depending on how many of these grains of rice end up in the palm of one's hand, you throw up a handful, maybe there's 20 you throw up in the air, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or a few will land in the palm of your hand. That flowchart, depending on how that's to be read as the next kind of action in this bringing together of the divine and the earthly, the grama and the aranya here. So without dwelling any longer really on the divination, let's just say that after that, then he took on this self-abhisheka. He poured this whole big vessel of milk on himself in order to turn himself into the deity, into the character, into the divine character of Arjuna. And then he poured another vessel of water over him, as they do in Abhisheka, to wash off the milk that was there. And then he dismounted from the stage, and his family members were there, his son was there, and he grabbed a hold of, embraced his son tightly. And as Purohitji has told me, that then that continued. He was tightly clasping his son for almost half an hour. And even though he must have been at least 80 years old from his looks, it was impossible, really, for people to unloosen the grasp or the grip that the senior Arjuna had onto the junior Arjuna as they danced around in this reverse, counterclockwise, anti-clockwise kind of dance step, which is performed in all of these rituals up there. So in this way, he passed on to his son, who was playing the role of Babrik or Babruvahana in the Sanskrit epic. And in this way, in this liminal space, the identity, the inheritance was conducted. So that's the third and final thing that I'm going to go into in this talk, but let me just conclude with one brief paragraph here out of a lot that I have here. Let me just talk about this last one here. In the third case study, which is my longer paper, the surprising rite of transference of an alternate identity as Arjuna by a Pandavlila actor in Himalaya to an act of possession illustrates that the Mahabharata, in its present form in Gadwal, which I can't even get into except that I've been heavily attuned to this for several years now, is not simply a text or story cycle, but a template through which the largely educated residents of these towns and villages live their lives. And I cannot emphasize more strongly, now having spent a lot of time up in Garhwal, that this is really a pretty prosperous part of India. Almost all people are educated. And so it's not that education by itself spoils a person's innocence and does not allow them to to get back into these liminal spaces, because it certainly does happen up there. So the actor had habituated himself to becoming Arjuna, to becoming possessed by Arjuna through a learned and repeated process of self-consecration. And this demonstrates that through the practice of a certain dissociation, deliberate practice of dissociation, which is part of our everyday lives, he was able to bring Arjuna to life, at least for the duration of the performance. And this is what's so gripping about these Leela performances, whether it's the Krishna Leela in Vrindavan or the Pandav Leela in the Himalaya, is that these characters, in a really, really tangible way, enter into the body and essence and voice of the actors who are doing this. So their practice from year to year becomes more and more sharp, and more natural. As the identity can shift between the actor and Arjuna, or Bhima, or Draupadi, or Kunti, or Karna, or Krishna, any of them in the Pandav Leelas. But it's not only the characters that are brought to life, it's the merging of the present with the historical presence of the Mahabharata that's resolved through this act of dissociation-induced possession. It's not just the division, it's not division and loss that are paramount in this performance, loss of identity, but revitalizing the ground beneath the feet of the community, bringing greater depth and purpose into their lives. And you can see this also in what's happened with Dharmaraja, with Yudhishthira, how much more alive, how much more whole he was once the forces of the wilderness embodied in Vidra, once he was able to reabsorb those and bring them into his own life. And we can see the whole temporary nature of this in the construction of the magical city that Yudhishthira had constructed, or Bhima actually, the chief architect there, had constructed for the Ashwamedha of Yudhishthira in the Ashwamedhika Parvan. So final point here is really that there's this continuing tradition, this continuing, let's say tradition is one thing, that's an easy word to use, but there are these practices, there are these strategies, there's this kind of inherent knowledge of bringing together the forces of the grama with the forces of the aranya. And these are, these indigenous categories, I guess, that I wanted to sort of bring in this talk here. So I am like Devin, and thank you for supporting me and being a little bit over time. So I will turn it back over to Srinivasji here, and thank all of you who are here on both WebEx and on Facebook, and for Professor Paranspe for mediating all of this, and for Sri Pankaj Jain for inviting me. And I look forward to spending more time at IIAS at some point, and hopefully near future, once it is possible to do such things. I have been there many, many times, and hope for a return. Thank you.
Thank you. Incidentally, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Incidentally, I am remembering one thing. The lecture also becomes in a significant time. Tomorrow being Akshaya Tritiya, Akatij, one of the important days, but that day happens to be a Balarama Jayanti. In fact, people say it is not Balarama, but Halarama. We have got 3 Ramas in the incarnation. Parasurama, who is marked by his axe. Then Kodan Rama, Rama with a bow. Then Halarama, Rama with a plow. So the plow is agriculture, that is from fruit gathering to, food production, like that. If you interpret the Dasavataras in any way, that may be, but anyway, it is Balarama Jayanti tomorrow. And thank you very much. Incidentally, I gave this information. Thank you very much. Yes?
Let me make one more point, since you brought up, because you have brought up Akshaya Tritiya tomorrow, And this is really, I mean, I'm glad you did this because it reminds me that Akshaya Tritiya is the one day of the year in which the forces of the grama and the aranya, of the sun and the moon, are brought together. Why is this? It's because if you look at the Indian system of Jyotisha, it is the only time in which both Surya and Chandra are in their state of exaltation. And that's why this is a celebrated moment. So this is the time that's brought together of these two major forces
That's why it is
of the
called
day
Krita
and
Yuga
night.
also. The commencement of the Krita. Okay, anyway, these are all aside informations. And now it is to Professor Makarand. Sir, the field is yours.
Thank you.
I think it can be open
No,
for
no,
questions.
thank you both for. No, I'm just saying thank you both for these very detailed, very thoughtful, and very well presented papers. We would take a day or so to really engage with them and tease out all their various implications. And in a sense, if you look at our schedule, we're supposed to be 5:30 when we end with the discussion, some closing remarks. But I think we should have at least a few questions out of respect for these brilliant papers. And maybe I will raise the first question to Professor Frederick Smith, which is about the Indian pastoral. You know, when as a student of literature, I read As You Like It. We always thought of the Western pastoral, going back to Juvenal and so forth, as a construct, you know, as a place of the idyllic forest world untainted by the court. And there's always a dialectic between court and the forest in Western literature. But eventually, these exiled princes who seem to actually celebrate the forest world return to cleansed court of the city and take over. So my question is, isn't it also the case, you mentioned how the Grameen absorbs, the energy of the forest here, but isn't it also that in the texts, these Aranyakas, the forest books, where the hermitages of the sages, were located, were also nurseries of the new world, and the themes of exile into the forest were a way of rejuvenating the just prince exiled because of a deep injustice. So my real question is that isn't it the case that the forest was never, because obviously there's a difference between the jungle and the forest. The forest is a much more tamed world in the West. I was surprised to see that when I visited Spain for the first time, I mean, I found no forest, so to speak, and I said, where are all the trees? They said, when they made the Armada, they cut all the trees. I don't know if it's true, but that's what my friends told me. And it's true about the wildlife too. I mean, much of the game that is in English, so to speak, country homes is very domesticated game. There's no wild animals. And when the British were in India, they probably finished most of our wild animals. You mentioned the rhino hunt. But anyhow, my point is really this, that isn't it the case that this world of the forest, or rather the jungle, is a place of rejuvenation and of the restoration of the natural order, which is corrupted by the world of culture of the court. And we see that in Dushyant and Shakuntala in the first Parva, Adi Parva of the Mahabharata.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good observation. In fact, I've thought about this, about looking at the grama from the perspective of Anya rather than the other way around, which is the way that we creatures of the grama, tend to look at things. And you're right in saying that the forest is kind of a liminal space. It's an intermediate zone between the jungle and the settlement. The jungle is really pretty forbidden, but the places where people will go for their vanaprastya, would be more of the forest area. The jungle is still pretty much out of bounds. And you're right in pointing that out. And there's lots of examples that I've also discussed where of looking at it from the other side, from the other angle. But yes, thank you for that point. Yeah. Others?
And I'll request those who haven't raised questions to raise them first, which means that we'll go to Saji Varghese ji and Anant Kumar Giriji later. But first, can we go to people who haven't said anything so far or wish to say certain things to both the papers, obviously, to the Tika paper as well. You can't do a Tika of a Tika of a Tika. That will be an endless regression. Let's leave a bit of the Tika incomplete, as you said, tantalizingly so. I was just thinking actually about the Naneshwari, which is such an important text when we transit into the vernacular, so to speak, which is both a translation and a commentary, and at times from Maharashtrians at that time who didn't know Sanskrit, actually a substitute for the Gita itself. You know, it takes a place in the heart of that culture, which is unrivaled. But anyhow, these those who have persisted, maybe Professor D.R. Purohit, Mahim, as you have been yclept, if I were to use medieval English. So yes, Professor Purohit. Anybody else wishes to raise a question? Dr. Balram Shukla, Professor Madhav Hada. Anyone else hasn't raised a question so far or made an observation gets the first shot. Professor Nataraj, yeah. Did you want to say something, Professor Nataraj?
Yes, I have some observation on Deven Patel's paper. Yeah.
Okay, first you and then Professor Purohit, please. Yes.
I enjoyed, both the papers, and extremely, they were very insightful. Dr. Deven Patel, I generally see, Bhashya and the Sutra literature, whether it is Brahma Sutra Bhashya or Mimamsa Sutra Bhashya or any Nyaya Darshana text, a Bhashya, a little differently from a Kavya Tika. You quoted Mallinatha, Iha Anvay Mukhene eva Sarvam Vyakhyayate Maya Namulam Likhite Kinchitna Anapekshitam Uchyate. That kind of a Kavya Tika, falls into a different category, I believe. But then when it comes to, if you see the Brahma Sutra Bhashya of Shankara, Bhaskara, Ramanuja, etc., the Bhashya sets the tone in Brahma Sutra on a couple of occasions on whether it upholds the Advaita thesis or not, it upholds the Jiva Brahmaikyata. There is ambiguity in the sutras, but it's the Bhashya that sets the whole tone, and that establishes a school of thought, and that seems more original. Bhashya was there. The Bhashya is the most original thinking, than the sutra literature itself. I see a kind of a little difference in these two genres, I believe. One, the Tika and the Kavyas, I bracket it in one place, and then I look at the Bhashyas and the Sutra literature at a different level. How do you respond to such an observation?
Thank you for such a good question. And I think it's such a complex network because, even with the philosophical Bhashya, we think of, say, Ramanujacharya, you have the Shri Bhashya, and then you have some texts like the Vedanta, the Vedartha Sangraha or something. One is kind of a Bhashya, one is an essay. And I think the big thing is, of course, that the big difference is that the Mimamsa and also these Bhashyas on the Vedanta Sutra, their job is to give an interpretation. Their job is to give a very clear argument for how to interpret the Upanishad. But Kavya operates on a different level, even though the form looks very similar. And I think that's one of the difficulties, is that we expect the Kavya Tika sometimes to operate in the same way, but the source is a very different attitude towards the source. And even though some of it is there, you are looking to maybe make an argument about something that you want the Kavya to read. But I think the situation of what the source is makes the two different processes. And so we should, study them separately also in that way, I think, just to, give a little bit of a more complex understanding of what is happening.
I want to say one thing here.
Exactly. I just
commentary.
Yeah. I just want to add a footnote. I want to add a footnote, and then please answer, since you're an expert yourself. Like Patanjali's Mahabhashya, and then it refers to Katyayana, which is supposed to be 1500 Vartikas or something, huge compared to Patanjali. So, a footnote to Nagaraju-ji's question, which is, can we lump them all together in the same, genre? Sorry, Srinivasan-ji, please go ahead.
I was about to say about that Katyayana, Vararuchi Swartika. It is not only Vararuchi Swartika, Patanjali quotes many of the peoples. Vararuchi Swartikas alone survived. In fact, there is Bharadwaja Vartika and other Vartika. In fact, Patanjali himself has got sutras. The Patanjali sutras are called Yushti. Panini's sutras are called Sutra. Vararuchis are called Vakya. And Patanjali's are called Yushti. There are 3 types of sutra. In fact, Yathotaram Muninam Pramanyam. In practical sciences, the later the sage or the later the author, more authoritative. It is not the authority of the earliest work or sutra work, etc. Patanjali is more authoritative than, even though it is not for Rudbergen and Joshi, Patanjali is more authoritative for the traditional people than Panini. Okay, but there are different types of commentaries. Bhashya is one type of a commentary, Bhashya is there in every field, but it is preferred more in philosophical and scientific discourses. Vakya or Vartika is a critique. Ukta, Anukta, Duruktanam, Chinta Yatra Pravartate. So in Vartika, the person discusses whatever is said, he explains it, he explicits it. Anukta, whatever is left unsaid, he adds it. Durukta, whatever is said wrongly, he corrects it. So Patanjali says, many of the say for example, Akas Savarne Dirgaha. This sutra is not required. You can say Akoki Dirgaha Ityevalam. Say for example, he changes many sutras. Like that possibility is there. But this particular person, Vakrokti Jivita is an Alankarika. While writing in the purpose of the Kavya, he says, Komala Buddhinam, those people like aristocrats and such people who happen to be a Kusuma Sukumara Buddhi, they will say. That is, whose brain is very tender, like what is called flowers, who may find it very difficult to grasp. For them, the Kavya commentary, but these are all system buildings. Professor Sir. Professor Smith, you want to say something?
I don't need to comment on this paper. No, thank you. I don't need to make any more comments on this.
Professor,
thank you.
around the paper, Srinivasan, may I make a small observation? I'm Purohit here.
You are free, sir.
So, Professor Frederick Smith talked about the Gramya and Aranya, and I think he forgot to mention it. Whenever we have in the hills, in the central Himalaya, which continue traveling for 6 months. And at the end of it, they have a huge grand ritual. And the place marked for the grand ritual is called Banyat. The ritual in the Bana, the ritual in the Aranya. So it is between the Gramya and the forest, that liminal space which he is talking about. And for 7 days, for 9 days, or for 24/7 days, they hold a huge ritual Yagya ritual, and that place is called Banyat. It's a ritual which is held neither in the forest nor in the village. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Anybody
you.
else?
Thank you, Purohitji. Yes, that's true. There is that Vanyam. I should actually make a note of that, but I did. I simply wanted to point out this one, but you're right about noting that word Vanyam. Yeah, thanks.
Kaji, do you want to come in and say a few words?
I just want to thank my Guruji, Professor Frederick
He's
Smith,
your
with whom.
guru after all. He's your guru after all.
Yes. Yes, I just am enthralled and just enjoyed. We discussed these topics when I took his course on Hinduism, environmental ethics, and these categories of forest and the city and forest, which my professor, I call him Fredji out of my love and respect. So Fredji and other Professor Philip Ludgendorf also had written the paper in the volume edited by Chris Chappell on this similar topic. I was just trying to recollect and trying to, I guess, wrestle with these categories, or maybe I can go back to Professor Smith himself and ask him what could be the issues. I mean, as scholars, of course, we always look for patterns. This forest has these characteristics, or city or village, grama or nagar has these characteristics. It is just so tempting to dichotomize everything. What could be the issues to not apply these categories and maybe look at them in a more fluid way? Can we have some overlaps? Because in forests, as we know, that forest is not really as far a space as we see in the other cultures, but here the education happens in forest, the retirement or semi-retirement happens in the forest, the retreats happen in the forest, the wisdom happens in the forest. So is it really fair to keep them separate, or maybe we can see some overlaps? If we can maybe share more insights, Reggie.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think that Purohitji has hit it with this notion of the Vanyam, also in Himalaya, in Garhwal. And but it gets back to something that I think that I said in the beginning, which is that if we look deeply into our minds, we're not going to see a forest, we're going to see a jungle. And only once we can kind of domesticate that jungle and turn it into a forest, because the illusion that we're presenting to the world is we've really created a grama, something completely orderly and systematic to the world, whereas that's basically skin deep. Below that we have the aranya, forest, in that sense, rather than the jungle. We have the jungle way deep. In fact, if you look at the history of Ayurveda and what basically the Ayurvedic texts will tell you, which is that the worst places to live, according to Charaka Sushruta, is coastal areas. And look at India today: Chennai, Mumbai, Kolkata, all of these cities around the coastal areas. These are considered to be the worst, the most unhealthy places to live. And the healthiest areas are the savanna, the kind of grassy areas, the areas that are midway between the jungles and the utterly unpredictable and disease-ridden coastal areas. So, I mean, we can see this thing replicated throughout. If we look at Indian history, at medicine, at epic, at performance, we see this kind of balancing act between the jungle, the forest, the settlement or village, and then at that time, maybe 2,000 years ago, time of Mahabharata, it's possible that the biggest cities in India, maybe like Indraprastha, or there might have been cities of 20 or 30,000 people. It's been long posited that the biggest city in deep antiquity in the entire world was Mohenjo-Daro with maybe 50,000 people. And that was probably bigger than any city in India until at least 1,000 or 1,500 years. So the complexity of the grama became, as it absorbed more and more features of the Aranya and even the jungle areas. For example, in the setting of the Ayodhya, there's always going to be deer and antelope and Krishnajina. They sit on the Krishnajina, on the black antelope's skin in the rituals. But there is no tiger involved. And among the only places you'll find mention of a tiger would be when you prescriptions in Charaka Sushruta for crushed up tiger toenails to be added to certain medications. I can say that I'm glad that I did not have the job of going and cutting the toenails of these tigers. But somehow they salvaged little bits and pieces of elements from the deep jungle. I'm sure that was to bring about certain very pitta reactions, something very violent like a tiger. But that's, but thoughts about these categories. In fact, it would be interesting to have a seminar sometime on the whole extensions into India of the notion of Vata, Pitta, and Agni and Soma, the basic ideas behind Ayurveda, and how these play out in the forms. It's just an idea. Anyway, enough.
Well, Ayurveda takes us in another direction. I know you have a book on it. I think you edited a book. I had a chance to look at it briefly. So this is a very rich area of inquiry. Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
And we've had really very, very, should I say, uplifting 2 days of discussion right in the middle of the pandemic. So I'm deeply grateful to everyone who joined in. And maybe Ananta Giriji, do you want to say a couple of words, and then we'll just wind up, unless anyone else has something, a burning thought, idea. Speaking of Flame University, if something really inflames you, Sati Varghese says that there's too much emphasis on the ontological here, very little on the political and social. Anyhow, I think in our open session we talked plenty about the politics of Indology. So I think it's good that we can leave that out here. Anantagiri, Professor, please say a few words, and then, unless anybody has, as I said, really a burning query, then we'll just wind down with a couple of words of thanks from Pankajji and myself. Go ahead, Dr. Giri, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, Professor Smith in your deep engagement with grammar and forest. Now, how do we look at forest also cross-culturally? For example, the category and the reality of the desert in Abrahamic religions and the forest and the Indic religions. Now, the Ashwamedha Yajna that is happening, you said that the great city was constructed, it was temporary. For example, was it constructed by burning the forest? My query is, what might be the possible link between Khandava Bana Dahana, the burning of the Khandava forest, and enactments like Ashwamedha Yajna, and your description of all these category diverse animals, where were they for? Were they to be sacrificed? And the category of the wise dharma, for example, both Vidura and Yudhishthira, my query is, if there is any critique of the act of burning, at least helpless creatures in these dynamics. And my very quick query to Professor Patel, thank you so much, is that this whole act of tika, now how it is also related to a community of reading. My point is the tikakara, is he only an individual actor or it is part of a community? And of course, as the grammatical structure is involved, there is a community involved. Your very creative engagement with this, I wanted to bring this dimension.
I think Professor Patel, you go first.
I think, as I would like to see it, is that the tikakaras represent a community of individuals, and I think that's something which is, I think, an exciting thing for us to, since we're moving beyond certain categories and thinking into the future, just think about how it's both an individual private act, but it's also bringing it into the public domain, and we can actually that, and I think that tradition captures both of these aspects, that there's a private and a public aspect, and that's and there's something shared but also something individuated, so it doesn't just bleed into this kind of deterministic sense of that it has to be one way, nor does it keep you isolated. So I think it's this is why the tradition is so exciting, I think, in many ways.
I was just thinking. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Go ahead. Go ahead. Please go ahead. Yes.
This one from Tamil tradition, you might have heard about the great Tamil scholar U.V. Swaminathan Iyer. He is called Tamil Tata, the grandfather of Tamil, and he is also the only one of the two Tamil scholars to conferred with the title Mahamahopadhyaya. He single-handedly traveled throughout Tamil Nadu, collected manuscripts, and then edited them. But for him, the ancient Tamil literature would not have been revealed at all. Okay. He was referring to one particular tradition. There is, as we have it in Sanskrit Panchamahakavyas, so too we have it in Tamil. There is one work called Chivaka Sindamani, which is a Jain work. This has been commented by one Nachinar Kiniyar. And the Nachinar Kiniyar, even in Tamil tradition, the commentaries are what is called presented Ranga Pravesa. That is, they have to be presented in the, just as original works are presented, commentaries too are presented in the midst of the scholars. They have to approve of it. And Nachinar Kiniyar's commentary has not been accepted by the Jain people. He is a Bharadwaja Gotri. He has written a commentary by his individual effort. And then they said, your presentation of Jainism is not authentic, it is not clear. He has written it from Tamil knowledge, not with the Jain knowledge. Then he went out, studied Jainism thoroughly under people, regular people, and then after learning Jainism, he has written another commentary, and then this was presented. Then scholars willingly and wholeheartedly approved it. And Uvesa records in his history, there are two commentaries written by Nachinar Kiniyar on that. Evidence is there for that. This shows that it is an individual effort also. And if you go to Vedic commentary, Sayana's commentary, that is a group effort. It depends on the size of the work, on the nature of the work, all those things. Thank you.
So what is the date of this Tamil scholar, Nachinar Kiniyar?
First millennium.
Okay. So it's very old. No, the only point I wanted to make a footnote to what even Ananta Giriji said is that Devanshi is a part of a reading group. I know there are many reading groups around, leading scholars, especially in the West, where studying Sanskrit is still, something that very few people do. So you need a community to support it. But imagine that a commentary might evolve through that kind of reading group and take on a particular character, and then one person takes it upon himself or herself to write it out, which retains the individuality of that person as well as reflects the opinion of the whole group. In
It depends on
reading
the,
a
it depends
master
on the
text.
it depends on the nature and size of the work. In fact, Haravijayam, that's also a very nearly around 1000 AD or something like that. That work also refers to the presentation of a book, that is the what is called book release. In the book release function, that speaks of about 40 people. What is called a chief minister takes the initiative to release the book. Some 40 people belonging to the court, etc., sit in the court, that is not in the king's court, the chief minister's court. They sit around, and then the book release takes place. But now what happens? Every single verse has to be read, and when the verse is read, the people have to approve of it. If there is some mistake, the people will question. Unless the mistake is resolved to their satisfaction, the person will not be allowed to proceed further, and the book will not be allowed to what is called to see the light of the day. It can remain in that room only, and then it has to be torn off. So in Haravijayam also you get how these books are presented, how the community goes into it, how all the people go into, even in the original book, how they go into find the mistakes, correct it. Say for example, in the Gita Govindam, you have the famous statement, Tava Sirasi Mandanam, Mama Sirasi Kandanam, Dehi Pada Pallavam Udaram. The story goes that it is an apocrypha. That is, Jayadeva is supposed to have rejected this verse because I am committing a blasphemy. So when he has gone for what is called the river to take bath, Krishna had come in the form of a Jayadeva and written the verse. That shows more than one people is taking part. It may be Krishna, it may be mythology, it may be apocryphal, etc. But the story, when the story is available for so many hundreds of years, so many centuries, that shows that more than one person has taken place or that has been accepted. The role of more than one person has been accepted in the commentary, reading literature, correction literature, and all those things. That can be an evidence for that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And now, Professor Smith, the last word.
Oh, well, thank you, Ananta Giriji, for your question. And it's one of those questions that could lead to an entire seminar. As how does this correspond with what you find in other textualities throughout the world? And I think that Professor Paranspe also began to discuss this. And this would be a very good subject for an entire seminar. So I will leave it at that at the moment and say, yes, there are these correspondences. There are these correlations. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. In fact,
Okay,
when
sir.
I first...
One sentence, sir.
Please.
I take this opportunity to thank Professor Makarand and Professor Pankaj Jain and IAAS and Flame University and all the connected people for giving me this opportunity to be with you for these 2 days. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. We will see more of you anon, I'm sure. But just to finish the earlier point, I just wanted to say when I first read the Adi Parva of Mahabharata, it was shocking to me the amount of the slaying of these forest animals, the heaps of carcasses, that these kings piled up as they went deeper and deeper into the forest, especially Shantanu, till he finds Shakuntala. And there is a way to read the Mahabharata as the revenge of, as the ecological revenge of nature, of Prakriti herself, of the forest and its denizens, the Vana people as well as the Vanavasis and, the entire so-called natural world, the jungle world, onto these people, onto these conquering and I would say marauding, what can you call them, Kshatriyas, and the bloodshed that the Kauravas and Pandavas meet upon each other is the revenge of the forest world, so to speak, upon these people. I mean, that's one way to read it from a eco-critical point of view, if you like. But Hari Anta, Hari Katha Ananta. So we are Ananta Giriji. So we'll stop there, Ananta ji. It is an endless discussion. So I
Sir,
guess I just want to thank everybody. Srinivas ji, do you want to say something? Do you want to say something?
because you have said something, I would like to add. The Mahabharata story, etc., they have got different layers as Adi Bhautika, Adhyatmika, etc. Say, regarding this Janamejaya Sarpa Yajna itself, there, if you look at it from modern angle, it may be, what I am saying may be a cock and bull story and all those things, but the world of dinosaurs, etc., are there, and before the world of dinosaurs, you had a reptilian world. So now what happens? This sort of reptilian world is presented in Mahabharata in the beginning. In the Adi Parva, that is in the Astika Parva, the reptilian world is presented, and the serpents, especially the very, very venomous serpents which are coming from ocean, they are killing all the people and not allowing anybody to live in this world. They have taken the roost. And Brahma himself curses the serpents, you will be lost. And then, of course, Kadru Vinata story, so many stories. So many curses on the serpents take place. And then consequently, Janamejaya Sarpa Yajna, it is not said just because his father has been cursed. It is not presented that way. It is presented from the reptilian world. When the Homo sapiens have to live, the word Homo sapien is not used there, but when these people have to take over, and when other people have to live, all the other animals also have to live, when they don't find a space. This sort of interpretation also, not interpretation, this sort of presentation also is there. There are so many, what is called simultaneous presentations. That's why the Mahabharata is said there are Manvadi Bharatam Kechit, Astikadi Tatovare, Tato Uparicharadanye, Vipra Samyak Adhiyire. There are three types of beginnings. So because there are three types of beginnings in Mahabharata, that is three Mahabharata, three types of the world beginning. So many accommodations have to be, we have to understand, involve the interview, all these things, or interpret all these things, accept, somehow or other we have to present. This as Mahabharata also is as complicated as the Indian situation.
Exactly. Pankaj, will you say a few words of thanks, and then I'll also couple and wind up. Go ahead.
Thank you all the participants and senior scholars and attendees for all your insightful presentations and questions, and all kinds of participation, tech support people, Gaurav ji, Akhilesh ji, everybody, Shantanu ji from my Flame side. And but before all, in addition to all the thank you and gratitude, I also want to ask still one more question, if I may, to both the Sanskrit scholars that we have, the guest speaker for Professor Smith, my professor 15 years back, and Professor Devin Patel. If you may also share your insights. Professor Smith just recently retired from my alma mater, from University of Iowa. So, he has spent his lifetime dedicated to Sanskrit study. He was also in Pune. His master's is from Bhandarkar in Pune. He has, I think, more Indian than some of us. He has seen things like Pandav Leela, who has, I've not seen Pandav Leela in Uttarakhand, even though I was born in India, and we have spent so much big life, period of time in India. But what can be, your, I guess, blessings for younger scholars and students, and advice from both of you, Professor Smith and Professor Patel, on the status of Sanskrit studies in India, and manuscripts or any other additional thoughts on Sanskrit study in general, especially now that you've seen the entire life of Sanskrit study in India and in US and elsewhere. And with that, I thank again everybody.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I suppose if I need to say anything, it's that I appreciate the opportunities that I was given when I began my studies. My MA is from Center for Advanced Study in Sanskrit at Pune University, and the the class in which I was, there were 25 people in that MA, in those MA classes, which was, kind of astonishingly huge. So the interest in Sanskrit has differed in the U.S., I can say, and in Europe. It's really very, very different places. In Europe, they're much more dedicated to foundational studies, texts, manuscripts. I mean, there are a few people in the U.S. who do study manuscripts and really go into deeply into those archives, but largely that's been taken over in Europe, and there's still a lot of this that goes on in India. So I'm hopeful that Sanskrit studies will continue to be serious, both in India and in the West. I mean, right now it's kind of difficult time, certainly because of the funding in both Europe and the U.S. and possibly elsewhere. So, but we hope that can be turned around at some point in the next generation. It takes a long time to build something, but once you cut off the funding supports, then they're easily destroyed with the way that academic institutions are constructed in outside India. I mean, we don't have like a UGC in the U.S. that we can depend on to bring us funding just because something happens to be good or worthwhile. There's a lot of other points that are considered, competing interests and competition. But we hope that the general interest can continue to flourish.
Well, about the next generation, Devan Patelji, somebody probably born and raised in the US, taking to Sanskrit studies is quite a miracle of sorts, a very positive sign. So perhaps you can tell us what prompted you to take this up and go into it so deeply as to make it a profession.
So much. I think, I have been, and, I have a more optimistic view. I think on some level, I have been very lucky to have had such great teachers, not only from the university circuits, the more kind of modern education, you can call it, but also the real blessing for me was to be able to study and to be in the presence of all of the great traditionally trained scholars, pundits, like Professor Srinivasan. I had an opportunity for almost 3 years in different stretches of time to travel all across India and to stay in the presence of and study, read, and just learn from so many such that long line of sort of great scholars and learned people. And I think that combination, and not only the teachers, but there are many students there. There are many people who are not professionals in Sanskrit, who are great readers, who are great thinkers, and I think the whole world is full of these people. I think sometimes we think of these things in these big categories of institutions and things like that, but I really feel like Sanskrit and these texts are still with us. These traditions are still with us because they are. I don't think that they will disappear. When I was Professor Goldman, who I studied with at Berkeley, he had done this project in the 80s and 90s where he had interviewed many traditional pundits in Sanskrit, and he had asked them, Idanim Sanskrita Panditya Hrasam Jatam. He used to ask them that it's diminishing. So what, Bhavishya Kale, what is their view of the future? And I asked the same questions to many scholars in the early 2000s and late 90s. And I also interviewed them. And I remember that some of the answers I got was that, maybe there won't be 10 such scholars in a village, but there will always be a few. And I still feel like that sense that the tradition will replenishes itself, and the material sells itself. So I think that it'll continue. So I have an optimism about these things, and I think it's anybody who reads these works are always transformed. So I think that there's still a place to study the classics, not just Sanskrit. I think this is the problem, right? There's so many, every language in the world, really, in India, but especially has a classical tradition. So I think that, I hope more people will continue to read those works in their own languages, and, Sanskrit they'll come to no matter what, but the other ones are more important as well at this moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity for me to give a speech. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you. I'm in fact thinking about the wonderful story of transmission from father to son that Professor Smith so eloquently expatiated. I think nowadays, even without that sort of embrace, there is a kind of transmission going on in a way that we didn't expect, because there's so many techies, so many other people who are taking to Sanskrit and classical texts all on their own, and they may not produce the knowledge that we consider, whatever, certified by peer-reviewed journals or books, or they're not part of the academy, but they're so active in their own ways that there is hope. So this is another, non-specialist realm of Indology that is just coming out. And in social media, you see it all over the place. Sometimes it's extremely fraught and I should say, even polemical. But anyhow, on that note, I also add my words of thanks and gratitude to Pankajji's, and want to really, really deeply appreciate all the great scholars who joined us in this difficult time of the pandemic. Thank you, Pankajji, for getting this conference going. It's a transcontinental conference, literally. We've had people from India, the United States, and England, and we hope to carry this dialogue forward. I want to thank the fellows of the Institute for joining in, because we've had some very difficult days. We lost a few people, some elderly folk, some retired people from the Institute, the parents of some of our employees, and actually one present employee and accounts assistant, we lost him to COVID just this past Sunday. So we're working from home. Our academic resource officer, Ritika ji, is in Lucknow. Other people are somewhere else. Gaurav ji is in Hamirpur. So it's been a bit of a challenge to get this going, but it's really been very, very rewarding, very uplifting. And I once again request everyone to please turn in their papers so that Pankaj and I can see what we can do with it. It would be a shame to let them go. Modified versions are welcome. Shorter versions are also welcome of some papers, and longer of others. It's entirely your choice. And we had an earlier roundtable, and we might see if we can retrieve some of those presentations, one of them by Professor Shukla himself, on Persian and Sanskrit grammar. I still remember it's a fascinating presentation he made, saying that after Persia got taken over by the Arabs in Islam, so to speak, their grammatical traditions got Arabized, but actually they're closer to Panini, if I remember right. And he illustrates with inflections and this and that. I mean, I don't have the paper in front of me, but there were some fascinating papers, one by Peter Schaff as well, another one by Professor Dominique Wojastik, and so on. So anyhow, I hope something can come out of this. And thank you all so much once again. And we hope to meet again virtually or actually. Fredji, you're most welcome to Shimla whenever you like. Just give us a heads up and just show up after the pandemic, of course. Thank you all once again. Thank you and good evening. Namaskar.
Let's keep doing these adventures more and more that transcends the geographical boundaries, time gaps. I'm in US and many others are spread across the world, and that transcends, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sanskrit studies, philosophy, history, all kinds of disciplines we brought in together. And I think we need more these kind of transcendental events with all of our support and energy.
Absolutely.
We'll do more.
In fact, now that you're mentioning it, Pankajji, I'm happy to announce that Lavanya-ji has agreed to lead a symposium on historiography, and we're just working out the details. It might be in two parts. The first part will be more theoretical, thrashing out the issues. The second part will be an actual examination of textbooks with experts in those areas and to see what can actually be done. Anyhow, with those hopeful words, I bid you all a very nice evening or morning, depending on where you are. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.